I have heard it said that there are amazing scientific miracles in the Quran, but where are they? Are they under Allah's throne? Are they in the heavens above us? Were they eaten by the black dog? Or maybe in the earths below us? No matter where they are, Thaddeus from Reason Answers and I will dive in and find the truth behind them. So without further ado, let's hit that intro. Okay, fantastic. So for those of you that may or may not know of Thaddeus from Recent Answers already, go and check him out. He has done amazing work, and I'm pretty excited to have him along to explain some of these miraculous miracles I keep hearing about in the comments, even if I have done shorts on them already, and people don't like me just pointing to my own videos, even though that's kind of the point of me doing the shorts. It's like, hey, over here, already did it. Don't have to do it again. We'll dive back into this again. So, Thaddeus, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Well, first, quickly on what you just said about pointing people to videos and then they're not responding. And Islam Critique just started a series recently on the Islamic echo chamber, where they don't want to hear any outside information. And I get the same thing. Someone will make a comment, I'll be like, oh yeah, no, I addressed that in this video, and they're like, I don't have time to watch your stupid video. Well, what are you doing on YouTube if you don't want to watch videos? YouTube isn't a chat system to come here and leave comments on videos you haven't watched. But strangely, I find that quite often Muslims come and leave comments on my videos, trying to guess the content, getting it wrong, proving they haven't watched the video, and yet thinking that they have somehow refuted me. Amazing stuff. So my name is Thaddeus. My channel is Reasoned Answers. I've been doing Islamic polemics for the past 4 or 5 years. I don't remember exactly when I started the channel, but I was doing it for a little while. Before that, got introduced to the subject through David Wood, as many of us have, and before that, I was just interested in general Christian apologetics. I've been doing apologetics for 20 plus years, spending a lot of time studying the gospel, studying the Bible, seeing if it stands up to historical scrutiny, seeing if it stands up to logical scrutiny. And I found that most religions don't have any kind of historical claim. They make claims about the unseen spiritual world. They make claims about morality. They make claims that are, while not entirely untestable, are not so easily tested as things that are historical. Christianity is quite different in that regard. It is 100% based on the truth of a historical event, specifically the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then Christianity is false, point blank. There is no Christianity without that event. When I was introduced to Islam in a more formal way, I had some knowledge of Islam. Don't get me wrong, I probably had more knowledge than the average Christian or the average person living in Western society does about Islam. But by no means did I understand what the religion's really about. And when I was introduced to it, I quickly discovered that it, like Christianity, is a religion based on historical claims. If there was never a man named Muhammad who revealed the Islamic texts, well then essentially Islam is false. If the Quran can be proven to not be the word of God, the literal speech of God, then Islam is false. So it like Christianity, makes these testable claims. And combining that fact, something I'm already interested in, putting my religion to the test, combining that fact with what I noticed was the abundant need. There are, 1.8 billion or whatever you want to put the exact number of Muslims at in the world. There are around 100 million atheists, and yet almost all of Christian apologetics is centered on atheism. because in the West it's kind of like Christianity or atheism, and we're like kind of ignoring the global picture where there are literally billions of people who are barely being ministered to. And because of the how it lined up with my interests combined with the need, I became very interested in talking about Islam and ultimately launched a YouTube channel, which is the last thing in the world I would have ever imagined myself doing, because I'm very much an introvert, very much socially reserved. Never imagined myself as a public speaker. Having private conversations with people about apologetics, great, love doing that. Public speaking, but God uses people who are not well equipped to do something so that He gets all the glory, and that's all I can say about the growth of my channel, because it's certainly not because of any innate skills I had. It's entirely down to what God has done.
Yeah, I would be right there with you on that whole introvert thing. Be like, oh no, I'm never going to do this thing. And then it's like, okay, fine, God, whatever you want, I'll do it. I really don't want to, but, obey and serve, and I'll do that. And I see a need for it. So yeah, I'm in the same boat. Yeah, He doesn't pick those that are boisterous and comfortable even.
Yep. Well, when you have a charismatic speaker, it's always a question whether the message is getting to people or whether the speaker is. And when you have someone who is not a great speaker, like myself, then any effects that we have, we know it's about the message, and that's what God wants. He wants it to be about the message. He doesn't want it to be about following a cult of personality. He wants it to be about following Him.
Yep. Sorry for derailing you a bit on that one. But I just
no.
I just saw that. I was like, yeah, that was, in fact, a little bit ago, we just did a stream on that. That was just inviting anyone to email me and contact me if they wanted to start doing apologetics or polemics or anything in that regard, so we can start talking about it. I know I've got a couple people that have reached out to me, so I'm looking forward to working with them. So
yeah, I would give that encouragement to anyone watching who is kind of thinking, I can't do this, but might be feeling a call to do it. Trust me, if I can do it, anyone can do it, because I'd be the last person you would imagine doing this. And, I'm well equipped to do the studying and the thinking and that kind of thing, that God has gifted me with those types of things. But as far as being a public figure and talking publicly, no, never. That's last on my list of things that I would imagine doing. And yet, that's what He chose for me.
Yep. So reach out to either one of us. I know you got your email there. Just contact us if you guys are interested in doing apologetics and getting started in this. We want to see more Christian apologists step up. I want to see, in my heart, my ideal would be that every single Christian that's out there is equipped and ready to deal with at least the basics of the question, of any questions that could come up from either Muslims, atheists, anything out there. Then be able to give a quick response and be able to deal with that. And I would love to see more people do that. So
yeah, absolutely. Not everyone's called to pastor a church or lead people, but every Christian is called to be an evangelist. Every Christian is called to spread the gospel. And that doesn't mean, being a public speaker for everyone, but everyone should be prepared to have these kinds of conversations with people personally. Everyone should be prepared to give an answer for their faith. We think of faith as blind trust. This has kind of been thrust upon us by a combination of the church reacting to certain things and atheists pushing that agenda. But in the biblical sense of the word, it means trust based on facts, based on information. It means placing your trust in what you know to be true. It doesn't mean, just deciding that you're going to believe something no matter what. It means placing your trust in what you know to be true based on your experience, the evidence, etc.
absolutely. So now that we've gone off on that bit of a tangent there, although it is critical, let's go and pull it on back to the subject at hand. So I believe you have a PowerPoint presentation all set up. All
Yep, you can pull that up.
What happens when you're prepped and prepared and ready to engage, and not throwing things together at last second. So, not that I've ever done that.
All right, so we're going to be talking about the Quran scientific miracles. As I said, Islam is a religion that's in theory based on history. It's based on objective facts. Yet whenever I have a conversation with Muslims, and I've asked virtually every Muslim that I've ever had a conversation with this question: what is your best evidence that Islam is true? I leave it open-ended. They can go to anything they want. The vast majority of the time, they'll just ignore the question, or they'll try to attack the Trinity, neither of which has anything to do with what I asked. Even if they could prove 100% Christianity is false, that would have nothing to do with the truth of Islam. In the rare case that they actually attempt to make an argument for Islam being true, it's usually that the Quran contains scientific miracles, which is weird because I just said that Islam is a historical religion. If I was a Muslim and I actually believed it was true, I would be trying to prove it true from history. I wouldn't be trying to go to the Quran and find secret knowledge, because that's what we really mean by scientific miracles. We mean this advanced scientific knowledge that no one could have known at the time. That was some kind of secret that was discovered eventually by non-Muslim scientists, but the Muslims had this knowledge all along. So let's go ahead and look at the claim from a couple of Muslims. I first have a quote from Quran for Kids. And I chose this, not because I wanted to pick like the dumbest presentation or the lowest level presentation, but I picked this for a specific reason. And that's because this really shows how important this is to the Muslim mindset. That they're teaching kids that this is one of the main reasons that you should believe in Islam, because the Quran contains this advanced scientific knowledge. The author of this website writes, "There's no denying that science was archaic and thoroughly outdated at the time of our prophet. In comparison to the present, certainly there were none of today's technological marvels that aid science available in that era. There were no telescopes, microscopes, etc. in the 7th century. Therefore, what were the odds of an illiterate, desert-dweller like Muhammad producing the scientific miracles of the Quran? Verily, the only possible answer is that he received a revelation from God." A couple things to point out here. I find it humorous that we're going to look at a quote from an adult arguing to a higher audience in a second, but invariably they always do the same thing, where they try to make Muhammad sound as incompetent as possible. They try to denigrate the 7th century as much as possible to try to elevate the importance of the so-called scientific information in the Quran. If these things were actually advanced knowledge, if they're actually fantastic that anyone would recognize, I don't think it would matter if Muhammad was the most intelligent, most well-educated person with the best resources of the 7th century. It would still be unexpected. It would still be miraculous, to use the Islamic word. So I find it very humorous that in order to elevate their religion, they denigrate their prophet. Any thoughts from you?
No, so they denigrate their prophet, put him down low, but yet somehow he's still the best example of humanity, except he's supposed to be this absolute fool, only when they need him to be an absolute fool. And needless to say, some of these claims, as I know we're going to get into, I have my opinion on how that makes the rest of the Quran look, but I'll hold that off for now.
All right, yeah. And along those notes, I'll just point out that the evidence suggests that Muhammad probably actually wasn't illiterate. And ironically, the idea that he was illiterate developed in response to Christian polemics against Islam. Christians were saying Muhammad is just copying the previous scriptures. Indeed, we see this in the Islamic texts themselves, that they claim there's claims about Muhammad copying the tales of the ancient. It makes it into the Quran itself. And the grand answer that they could come up with was, he could have been copying because he couldn't read, which doesn't actually work, but it starts the pattern of denigrating Muhammad to try to make him into a prophet, because he was just so incompetent that if he did anything, he must have been a prophet. So we got here from Umar and Nassar on his website, Rational Religion, making the claim in more adult terms. The Quran itself demonstrates its divine origin. One of the ways it does is through its description of scientific phenomena. God, knowing that atheist scientists in this age would lead people astray, revealed verses that detail major scientific phenomena. From the tongue of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, an illiterate man in the Arabian wilderness, came descriptions of natural phenomena that have only now been confirmed. Ancient Muslims either accepted these verses literally, or being unable to understand their physical reality, interpret them metaphorically. However, in today's age, we have seen their truth confirmed. All kinds of interesting stuff in this claim. I'll start with this one, though. The God, knowing that atheist scientists in this age would lead people astray. Apparently, the Quran, written for all people, all places, and all times, was written actually for atheist scientists of the 21st century, according to Umar. Very interesting, don't you think?
Oh, terribly interesting. It's the very fact they ignored all the centuries leading up to this point, and obviously the Quran isn't for anyone else, ever, except for everyone. Because it's a book for all people, except it can only be done in one language and only written in one language. Miraculous.
So apparently my microphone was a bit loud, so I turned it down. Let me know if that corrects the problem. Thank you for pointing that out, L. So we also have, again, saying that Muhammad's illiterate, that he couldn't have done this on his own. But notice what it says. It says, from the tongue of Muhammad. But we're talking about the Quran here. Very interesting that he's implying that the Quran is Muhammad's words. I often find Muslims implying that the Quran is Muhammad's words. Have you encountered the same thing?
Yes, it's awfully odd how it's supposed to be from Allah, but the only one that can hear Allah or interpret from Allah is the angel Gabriel, who's giving us to Muhammad. It sounds like 6th century phone tag, if you've ever played that.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, they could technically read this sentence and say, yeah, it came off his tongue, but it really came from Allah. But they want to ascribe it to Muhammad. If the Quran is really Allah's speech, then who cares who delivered it? If all Muhammad is a vehicle by which the word is spoken, then it's rather irrelevant whether he's illiterate, whether he's from the desert, whether he's from the 7th century. Very strange that they have to try to imply that it comes from Muhammad in order to make it seem miraculous. And then lastly, this author, Umar here, says that early Muslims interpreted these verses metaphorically. Now, I believe that Muhammad said that the earliest Muslims had the best knowledge, that they were the most well-informed. I believe Muhammad himself is supposed to be the best interpreter of the Quran. Yet here Umar is saying that only after science has discovered things, and Muslims have, well, let's be honest, used their imagination to pretend that the Quran says that it can be understood that way. I find that very strange, don't you?
Yes, it seems that they only get these scientific discoveries after someone else has already discovered them. And then it's obvious to them that this was, but isn't the Quran supposed to be, clear?
Yeah, it does say that this is a book that is perfectly clear. Strange. Guess we'll just have to leave that aside for now. Before we get into the actual look at the miracles, I think we need to talk about why we should care about this. When we look at these claims, they're very easy to laugh about. They're very easy to ignore. They usually all you have to do is read the verse and you're like, it doesn't say anything remotely like what you claim. And because they're so silly, Christians and other non-Muslims, we tend to see it and we're like, this is silly. Why would anyone want to talk about this? And generally, when I talk about this topic, the audience is smaller, and there's definitely less interest in this topic than some other things from the Christian side of the thing, which creates this vacuum where Muslims can give this argument to their own people, and it's never challenged, and it's always in the back of their mind that, yeah, they're telling me that Muhammad was an immoral pig, but I know that the Quran has proven to be miraculous. It's proven to have all this advanced scientific knowledge. Therefore, I don't need to worry about what you're saying. I can just totally ignore it. And I think that to be as effective as possible, we need to address not only the problems of Islam, which by all means, I think we should definitely be pointing out those moral problems. We should definitely be pointing out errors in the text. We should definitely be talking about all the things we usually talk about. But I think we should also take their best arguments, which according to them, this is one of their best arguments, and address them head on. Because that way, you're not just giving someone reasons to doubt things they've probably not heard about or they don't normally discuss, but you're also giving them reasons to doubt their fundamental confidence in Islam. And there really aren't very many positive arguments for Islam, so it's not that hard to address their positive arguments. So I think that we kind of need to adjust our strategy a bit here, and we need to address both the things that we usually do, the obvious moral problems with Islam, the obvious historical problems with Islam, and so forth, and also address the arguments that they make internally, because I definitely see a void. I look at a Muslim channel, they have, the 5 scientific miracles of the Quran, 2 million views. I look at a popular Christian channel, say Al-Fadi or David Wood, looking at science in the Quran, and it'll have, 30,000 views, which is a massive number, more than I would ever get, but small for that channel, below average for that channel, and nothing in comparison to the number of Muslims looking at this argument. Anything you'd like to add about why we should be making these arguments?
Well, if you're firm in what you believe and you think you have the truth, why would you look anywhere else for the truth when it comes down to it? If you believe that Islam is the way and you have all these scientific miracles to back it up, why would you take an honest look at Christianity? Why would you take an honest look outside of your own bubble? Definitely if you're being told from every point that you're hearing, oh, Islam is true. These miracles, they're miraculous. There's so much here in the Quran that is wonderful. Muhammad was the best man that ever lived. But you're never actually diving into the sources yourself and never actually reading it yourself. It's one of the things that I like to do is just sit down and actually read what they're saying it says and see if it actually pans out. Because a lot of times I'm seeing that as a gap, much as you were saying, that just, no, there's no one here that's actually just diving in and speaking on this when it comes to Muslim channels. There's this big void here. You're just taking their word. And again, that comes from the authority-based culture. You're taking their authority and saying it must be this way because they said it. And that's a sharp difference between Christianity and Islam, where Islam, you're supposed to just take whatever the teacher says and run with it. In Christianity, if I say something that's off, you guys are supposed to try to keep me on track. You're supposed to come up in the comments, say, hey, or even in an email to me, say, hey, brother in Christ, you said, Jesus wasn't God all of a sudden. That's not what the Bible says. Keep me accountable. But in Islam, there is none of that. You just take it and go with it. And a lot of times that leads to, a lot of copy and pasting. And you're using someone else's arguments as your own. And a massive issue with that, and I'm not coming down on anyone that's ever done that. I'm just pointing this simple fact out. If you copy and paste someone else's argument and it's not really yours, you're going to have nothing to follow up with if they just come back with even a basic question about it.
Yeah, and I find that a lot in the comments. It's kind of a waste of time to engage in the comments, but I do it anyway. And I usually just try to ask the Muslims questions about the usually copy and paste claim they're making, and they inevitably get lost pretty quickly. They have their initial comment, and then you ask them something, and they'll just like kind of try to rephrase their original comment and not answer the question at all because they really don't know what to do. They haven't thought about these things deeply. And sadly, I often open my streams to Muslims, and even when someone's brave enough to come up and talk with me live, they just do the same thing typically. There are exceptions. I don't want to put all Muslims in one category, but in my experience, the average Muslim, they just have one argument that they've memorized, and they're unable to articulate it beyond what they've memorized because they haven't really thought about it. They've just memorized it. And keep in mind, the people we're engaging with are people who are actually interested in talking with Christians. They're people who are actually interested in reaching out and doing dawah on the internet. The average Muslim that you'll meet in real life, they don't even have that memorized argument, and they have nothing to fall back on. If you just do a little bit of preparation, it can be daunting saying there's so much information out there. I can't possibly learn all that. You don't need to. You just need to have a basis to start the conversation. And if this is a real conversation you're having in real life, no reasonable person is going to say, well, you need to have the answer right now. If you don't have the answer, just say, I don't have the answer. That's good. I will research it. And can we schedule a time to meet up again? And any reasonable person who has any interest whatsoever in the truth will absolutely accept that. So you don't need to know everything, but you do. I definitely want to encourage people to get started and, start talking with people.
Yeah, I'd say that's something I've run into a lot. It's just, guys, if you don't know something, just say, I don't know. It's a perfectly fine answer. I've had to use that in the past when I didn't know things. I don't know. Let me go look it up, do some research, any references you guys have. So that would be fantastic. I have no issue with someone saying that.
Yeah, and no reasonable person would. Maybe the kind of person who's just trying to win an argument online, they might make fun of that, but no reasonable person who has any interest in the truth whatsoever would have a problem with that. So we know why we want to discuss this topic. But before we look at an example, we need to ask, is it even valid in principle? Like, if the Quran really did contain what the Muslims claim it did, that it really contained this advanced scientific knowledge, would that actually be a legitimate argument for Islam? And I think it would be. And, I wouldn't say that it would be 100% absolute proof, but I would say it would be a valid piece of evidence. It would be something to look at. You have to weigh all the evidence. You have to look at how many times it makes a scientific error. You can't just say because it has one advanced scientific knowledge that somehow proves it is from God. Assuming that it does. But I think it is a valid principle because it's kind of similar to an argument from prophecy. If you look at, say, the Old Testament and you see a prophecy that is fulfilled in Jesus, that is evidence that he is the Messiah. It's valid evidence. Is any piece of evidence absolute proof? No. There could be coincidence, there could be luck, there could be fitting the events to the way they're described to fit the prophecy. But when it happens time and time again, that becomes a really strong argument. And I think that's kind of the same principle as these scientific miracles, this advanced scientific knowledge. If the Quran really contains such things, I think they would be evidence of a divine authorship, provided that they are in sufficient number and there's not errors and so forth. because it would be evidence that a being that is more intelligent than, or maybe not intelligent, that's not the right word because humans of the past are not less intelligent, more knowledgeable, has the advantage of knowing everything. If we're talking about God, or from a modern human perspective, the advantage of standing on the shoulders of all these people who figured out all these things over time. That would be evidence. I think that in this case, some of the claims made by Muslims, like say it's the fastest growing religion, completely irrelevant even if true. But this one, I think, if it's true, would be relevant as evidence. What do you think?
Well, what I come down to, and I know you're saying that, we got to weigh the errors with what is correct. I would point out just simply, if it makes a claim like something hypothetically saying, hey, if it was from any other source, then you would find much contradiction in it. And you're like, wow. So that would mean that if I found even one scientific error that we know without a doubt is just absolutely false, then this litmus test that it itself gave us would prove that's wrong. Just hypothetically
Yeah,
speaking there.
just hypothetically, there isn't a verse like that in the Quran or anything. But yeah, if it was actually the literal speech of God as Muslims claim, and be clear, this is different than the Christian claim about the Bible, but if it's actually the literal speech of God, then it should be 100% without any error whatsoever. So one error actually would disprove that it's from a divine source. One advanced principle would not prove it by itself. Errors, because the claim is so strong, and this happens a lot in Islam, where they make these super strong claims that are really easy to be disproven. Well, that's great if they're true, but they're not, and then you have now totally destroyed your basis of understanding the Quran as being from God. Because if you had just claimed something like Christianity claims, where you say that it's the inspired word of God, where it's spoken through human beings in terms that humans understand, then things like, I don't know, the sun setting in a muddy pool of water, maybe you can give a metaphorical interpretation. Maybe you can look at the context and say, it's not really saying that this is a description of physical reality. It's making a different point. When you're talking about an all-knowing God who knows everything, who has all of eternity to get his word absolutely perfect, and then you need modern people arguing that the words don't really mean what they say, that's kind of a big problem, I would say. So looks like there's a question of whether we speak Arabic or not. So I will say that I do not speak Arabic. However, my question is, does that matter? Is the all-knowing speech of a perfect being impossible to be translated into another language? Is it impossible to study a language you don't know? And furthermore, to people who know modern Arabic, guess what? You don't know the language of the Quran either. It's spoken in ancient Arabic, which, like all language, changes over time. You can't just go to it and assume that your modern understanding of terms is what the text means. I can study the Bible that was written in Greek and Hebrew and a tiny bit in Aramaic without having intimate knowledge of those underlying languages, and I can do the same when it comes to the Quran. I've never heard a Muslim have any doubt that he can speak about the so-called errors of the Bible, despite never having the slightest clue about even what the underlying languages are. So why do you think this is a trump card for our talking about what the Quran says?
Now, to answer that on my behalf, I'm working on it. But yeah, it shouldn't matter. If it's perfectly clear as the Quran claims, then it should be perfectly clear no matter what language it's in.
Right. And to be clear, we're talking about factual, with the scientific claims, we're talking about factual matters. We're not talking about subtle differences in style and meaning and stuff like that, the kind of things that don't translate very well. We're talking about supposed objective facts that you can easily see in the text. If you can't easily see it in the text, then it's not there as far as what we're talking about. And we're talking about descriptions of physical reality. If it's supposed to be evidence, then it needs to be obvious enough to be seen without having this intimate knowledge of 7th century Arabic, especially since this is supposed to be the eternal word of God written before the foundation of the earth. How come it's only written in a language that most Muslims don't even know modern Arabic? 85% or so of Muslims don't know modern Arabic. And no one's ever says they're not true Muslims because they don't know Arabic. And no one says that they can't understand Islam from Muslim teachers. So why does this only work on outsiders? It doesn't make any sense.
Well, I'd say on top of that, if you're saying that this is a sign for the unbelievers in order to convert people to Islam, and no one is able to understand it or see it or, have record of it happening, seems like a pretty pathetic sign in my book.
Yeah. To be clear, the Quran doesn't claim that it's a sign of advanced knowledge. It doesn't claim that sign. But but modern Muslims are making that claim, and the claims that the Quran actually makes about its signs are even more pathetic. So yeah, if it's supposed to be evidence for me, if it's supposed to convince atheist scientists like the Muslim claim, then it better be pretty clear. It better be pretty clear. It better be pretty detailed. It better be something that really couldn't have been known in the 7th century. And just real quick follow up, he said that people who know Arabic say that the message is very different because Arabic has a much bigger vocabulary. That's a myth. The language in the world that has the most words is English. English has more words than any other language. You will find Muslims claiming that Arabic has more words. All they've done is they've taken the number of letters and multiplied it by to the third power. So I don't remember how many letters are in Arabic. 22, I think. 22 times 22 times 22. That's how many triliteral roots are possible, since every word has to be based on one of those. They claim that's a number of words. Most of those words don't mean anything. Whereas the actual number of words, English has like 10 times as many words as Arabic, and every other language for that matter.
And that comes from, actually, English has a very unique history of the language development. And I should probably do a video on it just for the fun of it. I know it has nothing to do with Islam necessarily, but the development of the English language is rather interesting. But I digress.
Yeah, and don't quote me on that 10 times. That's just off the top of my head, but it's definitely more, and by a several time factor at least. All right, so I've said that the criteria is valid at least in principle, keeping in mind that we have to look at errors and whatnot. However, we need some way to evaluate these claims. If it's going to be a claim that's objective and clear, we've kind of alluded to this, but now let's put some specific criteria on that. And to demonstrate why we need criteria, I'm going to play the Muslim game, but I'm going to do it with this text of unknown origin here. This is an ancient creation account. It comes from a religion. May the water be taken away, emptied out, so that the plate of the earth may be created. May it be gathered and become level. Then they called forth the mountains from the spring. Straightway the great mountains came to be. I just picked a random text. I looked for a passage, and then I did a search on the internet for something that would sound similar. And lo and behold, I found a scientific article. Earth's continental landmass created in short, fast bursts, say scientists. Well, look at this. We not only does this creation account say that the land was created after the water, it says that it was done so relatively quickly. Wow, that's just exactly like this scientific article. And indeed, I would say this claim more closely matches up than a lot of the Muslim claims with the text. So what do you think? Do you think that this is good evidence for this particular text?
You see, it must be a miracle. It must be a miracle from Allah. This message must be from Allah. There is no doubt. It's a miraculous miracle.
Yep. And I guarantee if this passage was from the Quran, they would absolutely be making claims like this, that articles like this confirm the Quran. Problem? This comes from the Popol Vuh, which is the Mayan creation account. So apparently the Mayans were actually Muslims. They actually were speaking with Allah. So let's go ahead and come up with some actual criteria so we can test these. Number one, the insight must be true. Seems pretty obvious, but it needs to be said because a lot of times I see Muslims making scientific miracle claims that aren't even scientifically true, by which I mean it doesn't match current scientific consensus. You can say that consensus will change. Depending on what you're talking about, it may be more or less probable, but it certainly can't be evidence for your religion if it doesn't match the current scientific consensus. I think that one's pretty obvious. Second criteria, the insight must go beyond what anyone can discover from careful observation with 7th century technology. This is why the Muslims keep and point out things like there was no microscopes, there was no telescopes, they lived in a backward society where no one knew anything. Well, they're right in principle. It has to be something that you couldn't observe in the 7th century. An ordinary, reasonable human being using their eyes, if they could see something, if it's correct, great, but it's not evidence that it comes from God. Agree?
Agree.
All right. Number 3, the claimed knowledge must be new to the Quran. This is kind of along the same lines, but it's a different way of looking at the question. If it's found in a previous text, then it obviously can't be proof of a divine origin. You could say that the previous people were lucky, that they were just speculating and they got it right. Fine, but you could just say the same thing about the Quran. If previous people looked at the world and they made conclusions about it and they happen to be correct, then a 7th century person could do the same. They also could have directly borrowed it from those sources, of course, and there is ample evidence of the author or authors of the Quran borrowing knowledge from their surroundings. But even if you want to pretend that they didn't have any access to this knowledge, say, oh, he couldn't have known that because the ancient Greeks knew that, and that was hundreds of years prior in a slightly different part of the world. Well, even if you say that he couldn't have gotten it directly from their texts, which is questionable, certainly could have come to the same conclusion by using the same methods that they did. And in number 4, this is the most important one because this is where the miracle usually happens. The miracle of reinterpretation. The Quran must actually say what the apologist claims, because just like I did with the Mayan account, you can use your creativity to make something match up if you really want it to do. This is also the trickiest because exegesis, there is a science to it. There is a technique to it. It's not something that Muslims are really familiar with how to do. And frankly, it's not something that most Christians do very well either. But I have a way of getting around this difficulty of properly exegeting the text. If the Quran's perfectly clear, if it should be obvious what its knowledge says, I don't have to rely on myself to read what it says. I don't have to debate with the Muslim what it says. I can just go to the tafsir. These are the best, most well-educated Muslims of the time. If it's actually making some sort of claim, even if it's not obvious to everyone, because people come to it with different abilities, it better be obvious to someone. So my criteria is at least one classical tafsir must make the same claim as the modern apologist claims. Of course, they don't have to use the modern scientific technical terms. They wouldn't know those terms, but they could describe the phenomenon in some words. Anything can be broken down into simpler words. So if no one ever saw this passage as, say, referring to the rapid expansion of space beginning from a small object, i.e. the Big Bang, then it doesn't mean that, because it's just a modern person reading their own creative interpretation into the text. What do you think about the fairness of that criteria?
I think this is very fair. It outlines it, so we have a nice pass and fail option. Um, with experience in this, I am afraid I know all the answers to all of them already. But we might as well go ahead and dive on through each of these.
All right, and I have one last criteria, which is not particularly important one, but supposed knowledge must go beyond a lucky guess. So if there's only two possibilities, if it's either it's a yes or a no, well, obviously someone could easily guess that. If it doesn't disprove it as a piece of evidence, it just means it's not a sufficient piece of evidence to stand on its own. If you have one event that's 50-50 guess and you get it right, that means nothing. If you have 20 events and they're all 50-50 guesses and you get them all right, that becomes more meaningful, a lot more meaningful. Kind of like I was alluding to with biblical prophecy, saying that the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. Lots of people were born in Bethlehem. I mean, only a small percentage of the total world population, but way more than one person. Obviously, being born in Bethlehem alone is not sufficient to prove that someone is the Messiah. But when you match it up with all the other criteria, then suddenly it becomes very meaningful. So we're going to start with one which we don't talk about a lot, but which I have found is perhaps the most important to the Muslim. And they don't use this one with outsiders generally. They only use this one internally, very interestingly. And that's the miracle of the seas not mixing. You may have heard it occasionally. Someone may bring it up. But it's not one that I heard very early on. It's not one I hear very often. When someone asked me to make a video on this subject specifically, I had heard it by then, but I started doing research, and the most popular Muslim video on this has millions of views. Whenever I would see a scientific thing talking about mixing of salt water and fresh water, didn't matter if it had anything whatsoever to do with the Quran. Like, that's not what they're talking about. It was just someone demonstrating in an experiment how water mixes. There'd be comment after comment in Muslims on the news article or the blog post or whatever saying, "This has confirmed the Quran. You have enhanced my faith," etc., etc. So it seems that this is actually one of the most important scientific miracles to them. So the way I've done this is we'll look at the verse, then we look at a claim from a Muslim so we can see their claim in their own words, and then we'll apply the criteria to it. Sahih International I will use today. It's not always perfectly accurate, but it's the most popular translation, and any translation on these things is basically going to say the same thing as long as they're honest enough to put the fake words in brackets and we can just remove them. Then we're good.
Oh,
He released...
real quick on that clarification. I just want to establish this because I've been told different things from some individuals. The brackets, the word in the brackets, what do they actually mean?
So those are words added by the translator that are not in the Arabic. They feel that they're clarifying the meaning of the text, but Allah didn't seem to think those words were necessary, so they're not in the Arabic.
Okay.
And sometimes, and in fairness, and sometimes I think that they're valid and they are just enhancing the readability of the text in English. We get this sometimes. Some translations of the Bible will do the same thing where they'll put words that aren't technically in the original language in italics or something. Because languages do have different sentence structures, there's sometimes clarification words are necessary. Like here where it adds the word so. That's probably legitimate. I'm not saying that the translator has done something wrong there, but this side by side, that's not implied by the Arabic. It's just talking about meeting. And they've added side by side to try to give you a better understanding of how they're meeting, which isn't actually in the text. It doesn't say how they meet. So reading the verse, he released the two seas, meeting between them is a barrier, so neither of them transgresses. From an article, the two seas meet but don't mix. on a website called the Mohammedan Way. I did not name it. Don't blame me. That's how they named their website.
It's not our website. Just putting that out there. It's not our website. It's not a Christian website. We didn't do this. Just clarification on that topic.
Perfect. These verses refer to two bodies of water, one salty and one sweet water, which meet but do not transgress or mix together. The two bodies of water have between them a barrier. A cup of salt water and a cup of sugar water will mix together when poured into a container. 2 cups of salt water will mix together very easily when combined, as they contain the same solute. Yet this verse of the Quran says that 2 bodies of salt water do not mix. The prophet is describing a barrier like the border of a country which neither body of water can encroach upon or transgress. One would expect a huge body of water like the Atlantic Ocean to overrun the much smaller Mediterranean Sea, yet researchers have found that the waters do not mix. He continues, the waters of one body of water do not mix with the other, nor do the fish of the Atlantic Ocean cross into the Mediterranean and vice versa. If a fish from one body of water is put in the other, it will become ill. The water of each ocean does not cross the invisible border between them. Rather, when they come to the barrier, they descend and go back, not crossing. And then he says this, no doubt there are rare cases of fish crossing between the two oceans, but not generally, just as diplomats of different nations cross each other's borders, but not the common citizens. So first he says that they don't, and then he says, well, maybe they do sometimes, and undermining his own claim there. There's a kind of 2 parts to this one. This won't generally be the case, but there's kind of 2 separate parts to this claim. So I have a second verse, which kind of says the same thing here, 25:53. And it is he who has released the 2 seas, one fresh and sweet, and one salty and bitter, and he placed between them a barrier and prohibiting partition. The article continues, fresh water is found in smaller bodies of water, such as rivers or lakes, while the large oceans and seas are salty. Although the enormous salty oceans could easily overrun the sweet fresh water of rivers, for some reason, and we'll get back to that, they cannot encroach on the rivers, and the 2 waters do not pass the barrier between them. The saltwater fish do not go into the fresh water, and the same is true of the freshwater fish. Neither can survive in the environment of the other, as has been mentioned also in the 2 bodies of water. And then again, he makes a claim and then immediately contradicts it. The case of salmon and steelhead trout, which are conceived and born in fresh water and then spend most of their lives in the oceans only to return to their place of birth and mate and die, are exceptions whose rarity and uniqueness only go to prove the rule. So it's a barrier that can't be transgressed. Fish that live in one type of environment never go into the other, except when they do, except when it is transgressed. Amazing claim here. Before I look at my criteria, any thoughts from you on how you feel about the claim so far?
It's very clear. There are no exceptions to it, except for when there are exceptions to it. Then those exceptions are okay because those are just exceptions. So obviously, when the Quran says they don't mix at all, they mean they only mix occasionally, maybe.
Yeah, it's a prohibiting partition. It's not a barrier that they kind of sometimes transgress and sometimes don't. And it's prohibited. They can't cross into one another. And we'll see, when we see how the tafsir look at this verse, we'll understand why that's the case. But the Muslim wants to claim something like what you see in this picture. And I've seen this exact picture or one that's almost identical to it on numerous Muslim websites, 100% of the time miscaptioned. They won't always be the same. Sometimes they'll say it's Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, or the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, or the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean, or the Black Sea, or what it actually is the Gulf of Alaska and its glacial runoff going into the ocean. And this so-called fixed barrier here, where there's this nice line, is actually constantly changing. It's moving back and forth. It's just that there's so much fresh water coming from the glaciers that temporarily they don't mix enough that you can see this distinct line. It's the only place on earth where there's this kind of distinct line, but the Muslim will just label it whatever particular two bodies of water they want it to be, because it's the only real visual example of this kind of thing. Ironically, if it was visually observable, as in this picture, then guess what? It wouldn't be miraculous to know about. Let's go ahead and look at the criteria. So first one, is it true? And I said that oftentimes the claim isn't even true, and that's the case here. Remember, there's two separate claims. There's this claim that two seas don't mix, and then there's this claim that salt and fresh water don't mix. They're not the same claim. And if you look at different arguments from Muslims, it was implied by this one. They won't, to be clear, they won't usually talk about the fish. That was just something weird he did. But they'll say, even seas that are basically the same, they don't mix either. And then they always go to the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. And as near as I can tell, the only reason they do that is probably because the first Muslim who came up with this argument used those two particular bodies of water as his example, because there's nothing special about that particular case. But I think because the first one did it and they all just copy and paste, it's always the go-to argument is the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea.
Again, that was the point we made earlier, saying use your own arguments. Stop just copying and pasting, because in the end, you just make yourself look like a fool. And I would love, I don't want you to look like a fool. I would love to have a seriously good intellectual discussion with someone that has more than just what someone else told them in their head.
Exactly. So, like I said, there's not really a fixed barrier. There is a meeting point, but that would be true regardless, right? Whether they mixed or didn't mix, there'd be a meeting point. They have to meet up somewhere. And so there's a meeting point. It's constantly changing. And guess what? There's constant mixing going on at that meeting point. To support their claims, I found this exact picture copied and pasted on many different Muslim websites, all about how miraculous this knowledge was. Again, copying and pasting it. There's nothing special about this picture. And I managed to track down the original source of this. It's like from a 1970s textbook. And the author of the passage, I'll give his exact words in a second. But as near as I can tell, there's no reason to signal out the Mediterranean Sea, except that the first Muslim probably did it. They've added color. This was originally a black and white drawing. And they've kind of added these two different colors to kind of make it look more dramatic. Like there's no mixing going on here. The caption in the article was something like, the mixing of the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. Whoops. I didn't mean to scroll up. Goodness. Amateur hour here. So this is the author's corresponding description of the text where he refers to the figure in question. Evaporation predominates over precipitation and runoff in the Mediterranean basin. Water must enter through the Strait of Gibraltar from the Atlantic to replenish the loss. Water is driven through the strait as a powerful current at 4 kilometers per hour. So not only is there not a lack of mixing, it's a powerful current. 4 kilometers an hour is how the mixing is going. What he's demonstrating here is that a large amount of water is entering from the Atlantic Ocean, and a small amount of water is being pushed out from the Mediterranean, temporarily not mixing because of a difference in salinity, but very quickly mixing. And we can also look at a modern current map that shows the same thing. The dark arrows are, it might be hard to see, but you can pause and enlarge it later or whatever. The dark arrows are surface level currents that are strong, and then the dotted arrows are underwater currents, which are weaker. And it matches up. We have a strong surface level current pushing into the Mediterranean Sea, and a weaker underwater current pushing outward, which causes this circulation of the water through the Mediterranean. And as the author said, the underlying cause is that the rainwater coming from Europe and Africa that drains into the Mediterranean is not enough to compensate for the rate of evaporation from the sun, so water spills in from the Atlantic. Nothing miraculous here, just water moving around just like it does anywhere else in the world. All right, what about his other claim? Because so we had the claim about the oceans, but then he also had this claim that for some reason the freshwater rivers don't get salty, that the ocean, which is much bigger, is unable to overcome the river and make it salty. Well, that's not true that they don't mix. Like if we're saying that this is support for the verse, it's not true that they don't mix. It's also common sense that the river enters the sea and not vice versa. All you have to do is go to anywhere where a river enters the sea and you can see the current visibly with your eyes pushing the water out into the ocean. And yes, they do mix. The verse is not about animals. And when the Muslim author tried to make it about animals, he contradicted himself by saying the animals do transgress it when they do, and it's only miraculous when they don't transgress it, I guess. Estuaries are these areas where salt and seawater mix. Shockingly enough, to support this claim, they draw another figure from the same book. Again, this book has nothing to do with anything Islamic. It's just a random textbook. Yet they all copy and paste the same pictures from that book. They take this picture, they add color, and like, look, there's different kinds of water. What the picture's actually showing is that the further you get from the mouth of the river, the more mixing has occurred. Where it starts at 0% salinity, completely fresh water, becomes 10, then 20, then 30. Because of the nature of the geography, sometimes there's places which we call estuaries where the salinity is different than either the freshwater or the ocean. Somewhere in between has its own unique life forms that live there. But it actually is the exact opposite of not mixing. These places exist because mixing has occurred. Any thoughts on it being true before we look at the other criteria?
You see, even these books who are not related to Islam prove without a shadow of a doubt after we alter them that it is true. After we changed everything. Just a little bit.
Yeah. We used our imagination. We figured out, but for the sake of completeness, let's just say that, I don't know what I'm talking about with the science. I got it all wrong. The Muslim who colored these pictures knows better than the author of the text who described the picture as giving evidence for, or as a picture of how the mixing occurs. Not that the mixing doesn't occur, but how it occurs. Let's just go ahead and look at the other criteria to be safe. I'm going to jump ahead to the fourth criteria because maybe it's the Muslim. Maybe I said it could be me that's mistaken. Maybe it's the Muslims mistaken. Maybe they have misinterpreted this verse and there is something miraculous here. So the three tafsirs that I looked at, and I would accept any other tafsir, to be clear. If a Muslim has a different tafsir that's not modern tafsirs, but any ancient tafsir written before the scientific revelation. But I looked at Ibn Kathir, Al-Tabari, and Al-Qurtubi because these are generally considered the best, most reliable tafsirs, not by me, but by Muslims. And the Muslims who take the time to really study their religion deeply, these are the tafsirs that they usually go to if they're not looking at a modern one. Ibn Kathir says point blank, the barrier is dry land. That's all he says. No, nothing about salt and fresh water or anything else. He just says that the barrier is dry land that prevents mixing. Al-Tabari gives that possibility, and then he gives a couple others, what we might consider rather unusual interpretations. One is the separation between the skies and the land, which doesn't make much sense to us, but it makes sense in the ancient mindset where there's a body of water surrounding the earth, and that's what causes rain is when it comes through the semi-permeable layer. So that's kind of what he has in mind there, that he's talking about, this air in between where the water and the sky is and the water and the land is. Or he also says it might be a completely metaphorical verse, that it could be about the sweet and salty people. You think that it's about salt water and fresh water, but no, it's actually about people who are amicable to the Muslim message and people who are against it. And then Kurtubi gives the same exact options as Al-Tabari. So these seem to be the three options ancient Muslims give. I definitely, in this case, I definitely could read the verse the way the Muslim wants me to read it about being saltwater and freshwater separation, and there being some kind of invisible barrier. I definitely could read that, but none of the Muslims saw that. They either thought it was a physical barrier in dry land or air, or they thought it was metaphorical. So not looking so great there. However, if it is dry land, at least it's scientifically accurate. Hooray, we've saved the science of the Quran. It's just talking about dry land in between rivers and lakes and the ocean. If it's talking about the skies and land, well, that's false because, like I said, it's based on the ancient idea of space being filled with water, which is not true. And if it's metaphorical, well, obviously it's not a scientific statement, so it can't be a scientific miracle. So there's no point in looking at the verse. So the only possibility that works is that it's dry land. However, and I think this is a reasonable description of the text because this verse occurs in a list of readily apparent signs of God's wisdom. The fact that it's God's wisdom is important here. So the author of the text is remarking about all the ways that God has set up the world that demonstrate how intelligent his creation is. The separation of fresh and salt waters is important for human beings because human beings can't drink salt water. They'll die if they do. Obviously not if they drink a small amount, but over time, if you drink nothing but salt water, you'll die. If you drink fresh water, you live. It's essential to human life. So yeah, I could see that as a sign of God's wisdom, absolutely. Not anything that any human being can't observe, obviously, but definitely a sign of God's wisdom. And additionally, the Quran refers to the two seas as opposed to just wherever there's seas, they don't mix. It says the two seas don't mix. It refers to the two seas and multiple other places in the Quran as if the person reading it knows what that refers to. So I think that one of these two physical interpretations is probably right. Either it is the dry land or it's the separation between the sky and the land. Since only the dry land is scientifically true, we'll be generous and say that's what the verse means. Any thoughts from you before we look at the last couple of criteria?
Well, I'd look through this list. I'd have to say, first of all, it's very clear that the Quran isn't clear. Because if you have all these different Muslim scholars, all these different books, and they're all taking it in extremely different ways, getting multiple interpretations off of this one, how can it be clear? And yeah, I've heard them say, well, it's only clear to those who are educated. Well, aren't these the educated people? And it doesn't seem that they got it. It's very clear. The separation between the skies and lands, even if that was the ancient idea of space being filled with water, I'd have to say that that wouldn't be what the Quran was intending, just because if you tried to make that fit, you would break the rest of the Quran. There are multiple other sections who say otherwise. So that couldn't be quite it. I still have some issues about the dry land being referred to as a sea, because that's new. I didn't know I was walking on water the entire time, but who's that picky, you know?
Well,
It's just interpretation.
Right, so it doesn't mix because it never comes in contact, right? That's the idea of the barrier being dry land. The salt and fresh water don't mix because they never come in contact to begin with. You got a lake, you got an ocean, they don't mix because they don't come in contact.
Yeah, you don't need to state that in a holy book. That's like 101 geography. It's not any miraculous anything.
Yeah.
You might as well just say
agree.
water is wet.
Yep. So we've kind of already alluded to the I accidentally went backwards. We've kind of already alluded to this, but if we're talking about dry land, super easily observable. If we're talking about what the Muslim claimed, which remember is actually false, but even if we are talking about what he claimed about rivers not mixing with oceans or whatever, then it's also observable. It's a little harder to observe. You have to go when like there's been torrential rain and there's a muddy runoff in it, so you can visually see different color of the water, like in the picture I cited. But it's absolutely observable by someone who goes to the sea. And I'm told by people who are fishermen, which is not me, but people who are commercial fishermen who spend a lot of time in the ocean, that through careful observation they can tell where water is, where currents are meeting, because there's subtle hints. You know, the way the boat is handled changes. Sometimes there's little bubbles. So observable any way you stack it. Is it an original idea? Is this something that no one had ever come up with before? And the answer to that is no as well. There are many texts that talk about how salt and fresh water have distinct natures, that they don't easily mix, that to be clear, they will mix given the right circumstances. Either, you stir it with a spoon, or you pour it more slowly and you wait long enough, they will eventually mix, but they don't easily mix. There's even texts that talk about how different seas meet. And I have just a couple of examples of previous texts here. We have James chapter 3. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and salt water? Can a fig tree, my brothers, bear olives, or a grapevine produce fruits? Neither can a salt pond yield fresh water. Obviously, James is using this as a metaphor for human beings, talking about believers and unbelievers. But you see the idea that he's saying that there are bodies of water that are salty, there's bodies of water that are fresh, and they don't mix together. In Pliny's Natural History, he writes, the fact that the nature of water is also not deficient in marvels. Patches of fresh water float on the surface of the sea, being doubtless lighter. Well, he's technically wrong about why they don't mix, but for our purposes, what's important here is that he's observing that fresh water sometimes, falling from rain or whatever, doesn't quickly mix with the sea, and you can find distinct patches of fresh water on top of the salt water. Very interesting, since this is supposedly the knowledge of a law alone, that Pliny has the same knowledge. Finally, in the book of Acts, we read, in the translation we read, but striking a reef. However, in the Greek, it actually says the place between two seas. It's an interpretation of the translator, that's a reef. They're correct. It's not an inaccurate translation, but literally, a reef in Greek is called the place between two seas, giving another indication of how people would be able to observe this. Where currents of coming from different directions meet up, you tend to get a lot of deposit. Over time it builds up and you get a sandbar or reef, and it becomes dangerous for a ship because the water is very shallow, runs into it, and that's exactly what happened in the book of Acts here. So we see three examples, three completely different contexts, three different ways that the Quran, if it claims what modern Muslims claim that it means, can not be seen as miraculous. Finally, ask the question, is it a lucky guess? Well, like I said, if there's only two possibilities, and in this case there are only two, either it mixes or it doesn't, and there's not really any other possibility, then that could be a lucky guess. If we're talking about connected seas and rivers, that might be a surprising guess. It would also be wrong, as we pointed out. If we're talking about types of water, just the more general meaning that salt water and fresh water don't mix together, that's not an unlikely guess, because if you think that things are of different nature, you can observe they don't mix. You can throw a stick into the water, it doesn't mix. And you can put a plant in the water, it doesn't mix. Well, if you think that salt water and fresh water are of completely different nature, they're a different substance that just happens to look the same, not unlikely that you would guess that they don't really mix very well. And finally, if we're talking about the physical barrier, either the land or the sky, well, that's completely obvious, so no guess needed. I'm about to reveal my conclusion, but I want to hear your conclusion first. Are you ready to convert to Islam? Has this miracle convinced you that the Quran is filled with advanced scientific knowledge?
Well, it's convinced me that if this was scientific knowledge, then the Bible already had it first. So obviously the Bible would be solely the word of Allah and be correct in everything then.
All right. I have to agree, unfortunately. I was really hoping to take my Shahada today, but yeah, this doesn't seem to be a miracle. It's either obvious knowledge that anyone would know, any person in the 7th century would know, or if we go with the Muslim claim as opposed to the obvious land barrier, then it's just an error. I don't think you have to be God Almighty to put a scientific error in your text, so no evidence that the Quran comes from God. There's a Muslim in the chat who just keeps insisting that we don't know Arabic, and
I've already proven why that doesn't
So
matter
just let me know why the translators of the Quran don't know Arabic, why the tafsirs don't know Arabic, why all pre-modern Muslims didn't know Arabic, because no one explained these miraculous things in easy to understand terms. They all just seemed to think that the Quran meant what it said. Strange. Or, I'm sorry, that the Quran meant what modern translators into English say that it means. All right. So perhaps you've heard this one, that
occasionally.
That the Quran predicted the Big Bang is how they usually say it. I'm actually going with an easier claim for the Quran. The Big Bang itself, that claim is so silly that I just could not justify spending a lot of time talking about it. But I'm going with a related claim, which is part of the Big Bang, but is not the more strong claim of the entirety of it, beginning with a tiny dot and exploding, for lack of a better term, and expanding outward. I'm going with just the expansion. We don't even have to have the starting as a tiny dot. We're just talking about the expansion of the universe. And for this one, they usually cite 51:47. And the heaven we constructed with strength, and indeed we are expander. The translator has to add its, which is important there because it's actually a verb it's a noun in Arabic. Sahih International doesn't make this disingenuous translation where they make it into a verb, but a lot of times they'll make it "we are expanding," like they'll and then add it, like "we are expanding it," changing it from a noun, which is important because look at the rest of the construction of the verse. We constructed with strength, and indeed we are its expander. I think the Sahih International here is correct, that it does mean its expander. In other words, the expander is describing Allah, not the universe. That's what I'm trying to get at here. It's not describing the expansion of the universe. It's describing Allah as what probably doesn't actually mean expander. We'll get to that in a minute. But let's look at the Islamic claim first. This comes from a website called Al Islam, very descriptive website. Their article, The Quran and Cosmology. At the time the Holy Quran was revealed, the human understanding of the nature of the cosmos and the movement or the stillness of the heavenly bodies was extremely primitive and obscure. The concept of the expanding universe has been universally accepted by the scientific community as fact. I don't know why they put that in scare quotes, but they did. This discovery was first made by Edwin Hubble in the 1920s, yet some 13 centuries before this, it was clearly mentioned in the Quran. It should be remembered that the concept of the continuous expansion of the universe is exclusive to the Quran. Keep that in mind. They're claiming it's exclusive. No other divine scriptures even remotely hint at it. First thoughts from you.
I've already done a short on this one, and yes, it is fun when you take out all the bracketed words and realize what the Quran actually said. But yes, I would definitely look at this and say, just on a primitive read, if someone just pointed me to this by itself, I'd say that expander would be a title that Allah is giving himself, and actually that would be in line with a lot of the other verses around this one, where he says, we did this, we are this. We did this, we are this. almost as if it was some sort of poem or some sort of well put together thing that the Muslims would agree about.
I will have to agree. So, is it true? We'll be quick. We'll say yes. There are scientists who say the universe isn't expanding. They're in the extreme minority. It's nearly universally accepted that the universe is expanding. They were technically incorrect when they said that this came about when Hubble observed it. That started the movement towards understanding that the universe is expanding. It's actually the discovery of cosmic background radiation much more recently that changed the scientific consensus. The process started with the observation from telescopes and whatnot, but it was only after the discovery of cosmic background radiation, which I think is in the 70s, that it became widely accepted in the scientific community that the universe is expanding. Was it observable? No, it couldn't directly be observed with 7th century technology. So far, so good. We're off to a much better start than the previous scientific miracle. Now, remember, the Muslims said, they claimed that absolutely no other religious text talked about the expanding universe. However, we should also look at non-religious texts. But even if we only look at religious texts, no, it's not really original. The exact wording of the Quran, especially since it doesn't actually say expanding, yeah, that's unique. Yeah, but is the idea of an expanding universe unique? No. So many cultures of the ancient Near East, the area of where Islam comes to be, had this conception called the cosmic egg or world egg. That's not something that's not a term they would use, but it's a term that people who study religion and talk about comparative religion, that they've come up with to kind of describe how a similar myth is prevalent in a large number of diverse religions. Especially religions that have either Hinduism or Zoroastrianism as their background. The idea of this cosmic egg is that the universe starts as an egg, like kind of basically literally an egg, like a chicken hatches out of an egg, the universe hatches out of an egg. The egg bursts open, and then the universe spreads and expands outward from that egg, usually pretty rapidly. Hey, side note, that's a better description of the Big Bang than the Quran. Just saying, if the Quran really wanted to describe the Big Bang, why not describe it as an egg? Human beings know eggs. They know what an egg looks like. They know how a large life form can emerge from a tiny egg. That's actually a pretty good description of the Big Bang in ancient terms. Not when the Quran uses one other religions of the ancient world to use. But let's just look at the expansion, because remember, we're not talking about the Big Bang. Let's just look at the expansion, because the cosmic egg doesn't necessarily require rapid expansion. Of course, the Quran doesn't require rapid expansion either. It doesn't talk about any time. But maybe that's more like growth. We want expansion. We don't want just growth, of a human or of a living organism. We want expansion. Well, let's just look at the book of Isaiah, shall we? It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to dwell in. And in 42:5, thus says God the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and what comes from it, who gives breath to the people and on it, and the spirit to those who walk in it. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, Isaiah seems to be a better description. Now, to be clear, I am not making a claim that Isaiah has advanced scientific knowledge, that it's describing the modern conception of the expansion of the universe. But if we're going to make that claim, to me, the book of Isaiah more accurately describes the expansion of the universe than the Quran. It uses better terms. It doesn't call God the expander. It talks about literally stretching out the heavens. I don't know how you could be more clear that they're expanding, right? And then they're being stretched out. And of course, Isaiah's point is that, you know, like he says, the inhabitants are like grasshoppers. We're like tiny little insignificant creatures compared to the power of God. Talking about how God has created the universe in all his wisdom and might. Not talking about how the universe was created. That's not his purpose. But if we're going to give it that purpose, I personally feel that this is a better description than the Quran. What do you think?
No, I think this is a lot more in depth. I mean, this is talking about something even current. I mean, it's using, I'd have to go back to the original language used as far as if I wanted to nitpick on the ing part of this. But at least at a face value, it sounds like it's talking about something that is currently going on, where we look at the Quran, we see a statement. Expander. Sounds like something that has already happened. He has already expanded it on face value. So I'd agree with you. This definitely shows a lot better of the universe expanding. Again, we're not making that claim. That would not be, that's not what the original author's intent is, obviously. And it would be a terrible misuse of the text to say, see, this is what he meant was the expansion of the universe. That would be us abusing the Bible and disrespecting it.
Exactly.
That is how you don't treat a holy text that you claim to follow.
So apostrophe says the earth is flat, question mark. I guess he's saying that because it says that spreads out the earth, I guess is what he's talking about. The Quran uses the exact same words to describe the earth, so I don't know why you're going to appeal to this being a flat earth here, especially since it says he who sits above the circle of the earth, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's spherical, but it at least could imply it. Again, better description than the Quran. Let's go ahead and ask the question, does the Quran teach it? And the answer is probably not. So the pre-Hubble translations, translations made before 1920, before the first inkling that the universe might be expanding in the scientific community, because to be clear, the scientific consensus from ancient times up until the 1920s among the intellectual was that the universe was eternal, that the universe was steady state, that it was not created, it just has always existed, and it's always existed in the same form. Contrary to what the Bible and other religious texts claim, that the scientific consensus was that the universe has no beginning, it doesn't expand, it just stays the same all the time. So when that was the scientific consensus, the Quran translations, they don't seem to think that this verse has anything to do with expansion. Yusuf Ali, for example, interprets the Arabic words, since Arabic keeps coming up, the Arabic words as meaning the following in English: with power and skill did we construct the firmament, for it is we who create the vastness of space. Verse 51:48 is parallel to the one that we looked at, and we've spread out the spacious earth, spacious being added by the translator. How excellently do we spread out? So whatever it means for the universe to be spread out, like these two verses, they use the same grammatical form, they are related in content. Quite reasonable to assume that assuming that the same author wrote both passages, which if it's God, clearly it's the same author, that they mean the same thing. So whatever he's talking about spreading out of the earth, or spreading out of the universe, he's talking about the same thing with the earth. If we're talking about the spreading out of the earth in the past tense, have spread out, and you made this point a second ago when we were talking about the Bible, then the spreading out of the universe would be past tense as well. The universe expanded and stopped expanding. The earth expanded and stopped expanding. But that's not what the scientific consensus is. So doesn't seem to be going so well for the Quran here. But let's look at the tafsir. Ibn Kathir says that the verse is referring to the vast space above the roof, just like Yusuf Ali, vastness. Nothing to do. Whoops, man, how do I keep doing that by accident? Nothing to nothing to do with expansion at all. It's talking about the amount of space. It's not talking about the expansion of space. It's talking about the amount. Al-Tabri, same idea. It's talking about a strong roof and a wide space. Again, amount of space, not expansion, not growth, just the amount. And Kurtubi says the verse speaks of the ability of God in either the space between God and man, or the abundance of life expanded by rain, or the enrichment of humanity. So Kurtubi kind of likes these more metaphorical interpretations in general, and that's kind of what he's doing here. But he does offer the same physical interpretation first, that it's talking about the large amount of space between man and God, physically speaking, and then he gives that in a metaphorical meaning. Then it's also the physical space is representative of our spiritual distance from God. When he's talking about the abundance of life expanded by rain, he's bringing in the Quran where it says that the heavens and the earth were split. We'll get to that in a minute because it's related to the next miracle. That's also where they go to justify the Big Bang. But he does see the verses that are related, but he's saying it's expanded means it's expanded by rain, not, the Big Bang or whatever. And then the last one, enrichment of humanity, purely metaphorical. So seems to me that it's more likely that the Arabic word translated as expander, or even less accurately as expanding, really refers not to the changing of dimensions, but the vastness of space in between. You mentioned you'd studied this before. Is that what you concluded as well?
Yeah. This is not meant to be an overall expanding the universe. Everything's happening. First of all, it refers to the heaven, expanding of the heaven, and he's the greatest expander. Well, which heaven? Which one of those heavens? Because there are 7 heavens. So is it only the first one? Is it the second one? The third one? Fourth one? Is it all of them? And again, it's done. It's over with. There isn't any continuation of this expansion that would make any sense.
Absolutely. So it looks like someone asked if you post these live streams online. I'm not sure what they mean.
You're
watching
so.
it online. You're watching it online now.
How else are you watching this thing? Because I want to know. That would be cool. Yeah, they're on YouTube on the channel that you're watching this. I hope. If not, I have a big issue.
Yeah, maybe that. Okay, so Rockster said maybe he means after it's done. Yeah, that's probably what he means. Does it save? Yes, it saves. It takes YouTube a little while to process it, so you won't see a link immediately. If you have the link, it will still work, but you won't see it on the channel page right away. If you save it now, it'll still work. But YouTube processes it, whatever that means, after the live stream ends, and then it reappears after a couple hours.
Yeah, so you guys can go back and watch your favorite sections.
Yeah.
As you see fit.
No, we didn't mock him, Mr. Quotation mark. I just didn't know what he meant. And then someone clarified it, and then we answered the question. Goodness gracious. All right. So was it a lucky guess? Well, there's 3 possibilities. The universe could be expanding, it could be contracting, or it could be staying the same. Like I said, the scientific consensus, or the intellectual consensus, was that the universe was a steady state. However, just because semi-modern man believed that doesn't mean that the ancients thought the same. The egg analogy and growth of life in general provide a ready reason for someone could guess the universe expanding. I think that actually makes perfect sense, that a human being thinking about how the physical world they live in could have come about might think that it's very similar to how how an animal comes about, that there's an egg, the egg hatches, it gets bigger over time. I think that's perfectly reasonable.
Yeah, to say that that's true throughout. I mean, there are multiple creation myths that have happened. The Greeks had a very similar one to what the Big Bang would be as far as expansion, and boom, it's there. I wouldn't say that was from God. There's a lot of other stuff around it, but I mean, if you want to make it fit, I mean, if you get a big enough hammer, you could definitely make it fit. Um, and there are, again, multiple other ones. So eventually, yeah, you could get one that would be close enough to what we scientifically see today to make it fit. And I'd have to look at this in context with the rest of the Quran and say, would this be talking about the expansion of the universe, or did the author of the Quran believe that this universe was stable, that it was not constantly changing? I would have to look at other parts of the Quran and say that this is clearly stating that the universe does not change, that this is how it's set up. And there are certain points, the muddy spring, all this other aspects of the world that the Quran builds is stable.
Yeah. If we look at the picture of the universe, the earth, physical creation, however you want to describe it, in the Quran, seems to very closely correspond to the consensus about the way the physical world was set up during the 7th century. Not strange if God is working through a human prophet to describe a spiritual message in people in terms people of the time understand, i.e. what we believe about the Bible. Rather strange if this is the eternal word of God written for all people, if it just happens to correspond to the beliefs of the 1 century where Muhammad lived. Just odd. I guess that doesn't mean anything. Just an odd coincidence. So I would say it's not a lucky guess. Before I reveal my overall conclusion, you ready to say your Shahada yet? Have you convinced that the universe is, that the Big Bang expansion of the universe, however you want to put it, is somehow evidence for Islam?
I was this close when we started. This close, but man, this just doesn't get me there. I need something more. Hopefully the next one. Maybe the next one.
Yeah, no problem. I got a couple more for you. But I do have to agree with your conclusion. At least the science was correct. At least they got the science right in this case. But there's no reason to believe that's what the text says. And similar ideas as what the Quran says, almost word for word in the case of Isaiah, actually. It's very similar terminology, are found in the Bible and other ancient texts. So if this is miraculous knowledge, I guess it was stolen from the Bible. So now we have the miracle of every living thing made from water. And this one is special to me because this is the first one I did. I know it's not necessarily like the most common among Muslims, but it's the first one that I looked at. So we have here an elephant made out of water. 2130. Have those who disbelieved not consider that the heavens and the earth were a joined entity, and we separated them and made from water every living thing. Then will they not believe? Now, like I said, we'll get a chance to look at this verse, which the separation of the heaven and the earth from being a joined entity supposedly describes the Big Bang. We won't be talking about that, but I'll just say that has nothing to do with the Big Bang. The heaven and the earth were never joined as an entity. Earth did not exist at the time of the Big Bang. It has nothing to do with that. But we will look at what the actual verse probably means in a little bit. So the miracles of the Quran, water, an article by a website called the Muslim Vibe. More than half your body weight is water. Animals and plants on Earth are mostly water. All life in our universe also needs water. When scientists search for life on exoplanets, they only look for planets with water. No water means no life. However, Muslims knew this about 1,400 years before it was discovered. Yeah, we'll get to that In the Quran, all life on earth and in the heavens depends on water. And that's also not true. How could an illiterate man who lived 1400 years ago have known that all life in the universe also needs water? What do you think on the surface? Before we look at the criteria, what do you think of this one?
That's amazing because I mean they must have started drinking water after this point. I mean, yeah. If you look at it and say, we live in the desert. If someone doesn't drink water, they kill over and die. Water must be important to life.
Yeah, I think that might be my conclusion as to whether it's observable. When I made a video on this, I was responding to a specific Muslim video, and they brought in the fact that even microscopic life, bringing in those microscopes, even microscopic life is dependent on water, and Muhammad couldn't have known about microscopic life. True, but irrelevant, because you don't have to know microscopic life exists to make a statement that all life you know about depends on water, and it happened to also be true about life you didn't know about. So not really relevant that he didn't know about microscopic life. So is it true? I'll give this one a yes. All living creatures are composed largely of water. Remember, there's two criteria that they're saying, basically, that life is mostly made of water and that life is dependent on water. Kind of similar, but slightly different. Technically, the miracle is supposed to be the composed, right? Because the Quran verse says, we made from water every living thing. So every creature is composed of the water element. So that's what we really should be looking at, is what things are composed of. Yes, all living creatures are composed mostly of water. There are people who speculate that water might not be essential to any form of life, that there could be life without water, but as far as we know, all life is dependent on water. So was it observable? Well, yeah, it's pretty obvious. 7th century people were readily aware that if you cut open a plant or an animal, it's going to have water inside, or at least liquid inside, which in the ancient mindset is basically equivalent to water. We'll get to why that is in a second. And furthermore, they knew that animals and plants are dependent on water and that they die without water, which should give you an idea that they probably have a lot of water inside them as well. Like I said, the Quran doesn't mention microscopic creatures, so the discovery of microscopic creatures later on that are also dependent on water or also composed of water is irrelevant to the matter. So we're already out of the terms of it being a miracle, since you can observe it by looking inside animals or plants and seeing they have water inside them, or feeling that they're squishy and concluding there's water. But let's continue on anyway. So is it original to water, or is it original to the Quran? And the answer here is absolutely not. There is no way that this idea is original to the Quran. Greek philosophy had decided that everything was composed of 4 elements. You got earth, air, fire, and water, all by the first millennia BC. And not only had they concluded that, other cultures who probably did not have direct contact with Greek philosophers came up with very similar ideas, that there are a small number of material elements of which everything is composed, and water is one of those elements, i.e. anything that is liquid is, in the ancient concept, has water as one of its elements. So, you observe blood, that is some combination of water and earth and fire and air. Mostly water, some small percentage of the other ones. I don't know offhand exactly what they said about blood, but that's the idea, that everything can be broken down into one or more of those 4 elements. Water being pure, I saw Elle alluded to this in the chat, that water is not defiled by anything. Yeah, it's not defiled by anything because it's a pure element. It's one of the 4 elements that can't be broken down into smaller pieces. The Quran seems to think that 4-element theory is true. And how do we know that? I like to point to this Quran verse, 55, 14 through 15. He created man from sounding clay like unto pottery, and he created jinns from fire free of smoke. This contains all four of the elements. It might not be obvious to someone who's not versed in four-element theory, but to someone living at the time, it would have been obvious what this is saying. Because clay is the combination of earth and water. And the djinn are composed of fire. Wait a minute, I thought all life was composed of water. Jinns are life. They're composed with fire, which is an element that contains no water. All right, sorry. We'll ignore the contradiction of the Quran. That's not what we're talking about.
Nope,
we'll move on.
Yet.
But smoke is synonymous with air in four-element literature. So when it's saying fire free of smoke, it's saying pure fire element. No air mixed with it. It's just the fire element. So very interesting that they're adopting this. But let's go further. That just suggests that there's four elements. Living creatures have to be composed of one or more of those. Let's see if some of the philosophers knew that life specifically comes from water. So Thales of Miletus suggests that water is the fundamental element. He's actually disagreeing with the prevailing four element. So in four element theory, one of the things they were always trying to do is determine what was the most fundamental. That either the other elements are derivatives of the one. So, and they would disagree about which one. In Thales' case, he's arguing that water is the fundamental element and then the others are derived from it. Or they suggested a fifth element, which everything is composed of, including the four elements, which is the quintessence. And no doubt you've heard that word. Well, quint is fifth. It's the fifth element. Quintessence is the fifth element. In modern English, it just means the fundamental nature. But in Greek thought, it literally was talking about the fifth element, which the other four elements are composed of. So if everything's composed of water, according to Thales, then obviously life forms are composed of water as well. But we can do even better in Anaximander, who wrote about the same time, so 600 BC, give or take, and offers direct parallels to the Quran. Very similar statements. He says that living creatures arose from the moist element when it was evaporated by the sun. And elsewhere in another writing, he says the first living creatures were produced in the moist element. So he specifically ties living creatures to water, or the moist element, as it can also be described as. And then he proposes that somehow the sun's energy changed that water into the life forms by mixing it with the other elements, etc., etc. Point being, for the Quran's purpose, saying the exact same thing, that all living creatures come from water. Anything you want to add?
Not really. I mean, this is pretty thorough. I'd have to go back to the very beginning when we were talking about how Muslims just seem to dumb down Muhammad. Do remember that Muhammad was a traitor. He traveled around, at least according to the Islamic sources. He was a trader who was supposed to travel around. So it's not like he would not have interacted with people with knowledge of this sort or familiar. The very fact that these two separate accounts look very similar make me wonder a couple of things. Either they are looking at the same source or the same event, or at least have knowledge of them, each other, in some way. So I'd have some questions about where the Quran got this concept from.
Yeah, to be clear here, I don't think that the author would necessarily have had to come in contact with these specific Greek philosophers. Four-element theory is so prevalent, and that it's basically just taken for granted that everyone believes this, that the author probably was just aware of the ideas from floating around in society. Whether he was literate or not is completely irrelevant. Everyone would have believed this kind of thing during his time. So does the Quran teach it? And this one, I think, is the most strange of the ones that we look at, because it actually does appear, just in a straightforward reading of the text, it does appear that the Quran is saying that living creatures are made up of water. However, the tafsirs don't see it that way. They say that the verse should make sense, that the entire verse should have one meaning. That the first half of the verse, which remember it talks about the splitting of the heaven and the earth, should relate to the second half of how creatures are composed of water. So they seek to understand the second half of the verse in light of the first one. Ibn Kathir says that the heavens and earth were originally joined together, and when they were split, the sky was created. So, he's thinking of two solid objects. He's thinking of space as a solid object, or heavens as a solid object. When they're split, then this void of empty air is created, which we call sky, and that caused rain, which then brought life. So he's saying that the splitting allows water to come in, causing rain. Then life can come about from the rainwater. Al-Tabari offers various opinions about the first half of the verse, the splitting, something Muslims had a very hard time understanding. Modern Muslims have a hard time understanding because it doesn't really seem to make any sense. But all of the opinions that he cited on the first half, where they say various different things about what that splitting means, they all agree that rain is what the second half of the verse refers to. Kurtubi offers various opinions on the first half. On the second half, he says that it could be rain, or that everything needs water to survive, which is sort of related to the idea that we're describing, but also very obvious. Or that everything is made from ice. Interesting that he chooses the solid form of water. I don't know where he gets that from. It's not obvious in the verse. Or that everything's made of water. So, hey, the last opinion of Al-Qurtubi, and he usually lists the weakest opinion last, and not found in any other tafsirs. But hey, someone said it, which was my only criteria. So plus that does seem to be a straightforward reading of the text. I'm actually willing to give this one a pass. I'm being generous here. I'm being as generous as possible. If we were just going on what the most probable interpretation of the verse is, based on the consensus of the ancient commentators, it looks like rain. Not that life comes from water, but rather that rain causes life to come about. But someone said that life is composed of water, so I'm actually giving this one a pass because I'm generous.
Oh, so generous of you.
Hey, I want to give the best case. I want to give the Muslim the best case. This is why I start by reading the Muslim text. I could give my interpretation of the text. I could, as Hamza says, just go with what people say, but I'm actually looking at a variety of opinions. I'm trying to find the best argument. I'm trying to find the best argument a Muslim can give and address that argument. He's appealed to his own ignorance, saying he doesn't know these things very well. Well, can't find a better argument. He says that you don't know Arabic, so you don't know what the Arabic really says. Okay, but surely some Muslim knows. Surely they can come up with a better argument. I can't find one. So if you find a better argument.
They are specifically the ones who earlier I was talking about challenged me and said, see all these miracles. So, and then I pointed this out even before this whole conversation, even before they joined, saying that they are using someone else's arguments because as soon as it's shown, they have nothing else. And they are just arguing now ignorance.
So let me just rephrase this. The Muslim starts by claiming that this is obvious evidence that Islam is true. You go and look at the Quran in an English translation made by a Muslim who's probably an expert at Arabic and wants to get the Quran right because they're Muslim. They want to get it right. You read the English and it doesn't appear to say what the Muslim claims. And then he says, you don't know Arabic. And I'm like, all right, can you explain why no one saw this? No, I don't have enough knowledge to tell you that. How is this evidence for your religion exactly? You're the one who made this a claim. I didn't go to the Quran and say, I'm going to look for scientific errors in the Quran. You went to the Quran, told me it has scientific evidence to back your religion. I looked at it. I found it lacking. And all you could say in response is, I don't have enough knowledge to explain how it works in the Arabic. Do you really have evidence, or are you just blindly believing that someone else has evidence? So we have to ask the question, was it a lucky guess? So this one's a little trickier because we don't really know what our space of guesses is. If it's 4-element theory, well, then you got 4 elements, and 3 of them, assuming the truth of 4-element theory, which obviously isn't true, but assuming the truth of it, 3 of them are elements in living creatures. You can easily see how Earth would be an element. You can kind of see how air is an element. Indeed, the classical explanation of why there's 4 elements is a burning log, because you observe all 4 of the elements when you burn a log. So you have the log broken down into ash, that's the earth. You have the smoke coming off, that's the air. You can obviously observe the fire. And then if you look really closely, you'll see water bubbling out of the log, that's the water. So generally, living things have at least the 3 elements, fire being an element that's introduced to it to break it down. But in theory, anyone could, in theory, say any random thing. They wouldn't necessarily have to believe in 4-element theory. They could say that all living creatures are composed of applesauce. So let's just say that it's not a lucky guess, that if you had no knowledge about anything and you're just guessing what creatures were composed of and you guessed water, that would be more than a lucky guess. Whoops, I didn't mean to reveal my conclusion, but without asking you, but I imagine you probably came to the same conclusion. I'll go ahead and read mine first. Science is correct, but easily observable and well-known information at the time of the Cron's composition. Later discoveries of microscopic creatures is irrelevant. So what do you think? Am I right here?
I have to agree with you. As sad as this is, I have to give you this one because, yeah, it was well-known at the time. The Greeks had myths about it. It was in Greek mythology even. So it's something that existed long before Islam came along. So, yeah, there's no evidence for this being a miraculous sign.
Man. Well, I have one more. And I know from talking to you in advance, this one is your favorite. It is probably the one that I see most commonly advanced in comments from Muslims to non-Muslims. And that's the miracle of the iron being sent down. Before I read the verse, do you want to comment on this one?
No, I'm good. I'm not. I'm resisting. I don't want to spoil anything.
All right. Let's look at the claim before we rip this one apart, because this one's perhaps the most humorous of the claims when we really understand what the claim would imply. Anyway, let's read the verse. We have already sent our messengers with clear evidences and sent down with them the scripture and the balance that the people may maintain in justice. And we sent down iron, wherein is great military might and benefits for the people, and so that Allah may make evident those who support him and his messengers unseen. So what's the miracle here? Well, we have the miracle of iron by a website called The Religion of Islam. They explain
impartial.
Yeah, completely impartial. The word anzalna, translated as sent down, and used for iron in this verse, could be thought of having a metaphorical meaning to explain that iron has been given to benefit people. They admitted that could be metaphorical. But wait. But when we take into consideration the literal meaning of the word, which is being physically sent down from the sky, as this word usage has not been employed in the Quran except literally, keep that in mind, like the descending of the rain or revelation. Side note, is descending of revelation literal? Well, I guess maybe, if you're like thinking of Gabriel. I guess that's how they made it literal. We realize that this verse implies a very significant scientific miracle because modern astronomical findings have disclosed that iron found in our world has come from giant stars in outer space. Is this how you've heard the claim made?
Oh, yes.
All right.
Many times.
So I'm not
Many
just
times.
making, I'm just not just like, choosing a bad argument here from a Christian who doesn't understand the Quran and is painting a straw man, but this is actually how Muslims make the argument. All right, let's take a look. So is it true? Well, sort of. It's only even sort of true on the claim that they're making. It's sort of true because iron, like all elements heavier than helium, is formed in supernovas. But that's why I said it's only sort of, because it's literally every single element except for hydrogen and helium is formed in supernovas. So every element, not just iron, but every element comes from outer space. However, there is also a possibility that it's more direct in the case of iron, which we'll get to in a second. So indeed, our entire solar system is the debris of previous supernovas, according to the scientific consensus. So literally everything in our solar system is sent down in the same way that iron is. Well, iron does, as well as other heavy elements, land on the Earth from meteorites. However, that isn't where most iron on Earth comes from. So there is a more literal being sent down, and there is this being sent down in the form of meteorites, that a small amount of iron comes from meteorites, and we'll see why that's important in a second. But the vast majority of iron that comes out of the ground has been there since the Earth was formed. It's always been there. It didn't come down in a different way than anything else that is on Earth came down. So was it observable? Well, if we're talking about the meteorites, right? If we're talking about the meteorites, this is the only thing that is literally sent down. In principle, it could be. Now, you may think that that's kind of strange for me to say that someone could determine that iron comes from meteorites, directly observing that a meteorite hits, and then they went and found where it hit, and they found iron there. However, as strange as that may seem, that's almost certainly exactly what happened, because the ancient world, long before Muhammad, referred to iron in terms that are describing it as coming from heaven. For example, and not exclusively here, I have more examples on the next page, but for example, the ancient Egyptians, their word for iron, what we call iron, literally means metal from heaven. That's literally what the term means. When you see a translation of a hieroglyph into English and it says iron, it literally says metal from heaven. The word is ba and pet, which means literally stone or metal from heaven. And the Egyptians thought that what we call outer space or heaven, they thought it was literally composed of this metal. Like they thought that was the primary element that outer space was composed of, is iron or the metal from heaven, as they call it. That's why it's called that. That when it manages to come down to earth, it's a piece of heaven breaking off and coming to earth. That's what they thought about the case. What about others? So is it original to the Quran? Well, what I just said about Egypt already disproves that. But it's not just Egypt. It's not just that they had some strange idea, but several cultures had the same idea, that iron comes from space. And the reason is because in ancient times, the iron, the primary iron that we can get out of the ground, it's mixed with rocks. It's very difficult to extract from rocks, and process is called smelting, where you break the metal from the rocks. It was a major development in human history when they learned how to refine iron from rocks. It marks the transformation from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, a very important development. The cultures that I'm describing here would have been before that time, for the most part. So the only source of iron that they had access to was meteorite iron. And in the Tibetan language, the word togcha means sky iron. So their word for iron literally means sky iron or sky metal, just like in Egypt. And iron from meteorites was highly prized. It's a rare thing. It obviously has intrinsic value in addition to the additional value people attribute to it for being rare, because it's much stronger than metals that humans could refine at the time. So it has great value, and because of that, it was actually used as a currency. It was used as a form of currency, and elite rich rulers, they made jewelry out of iron because of how valuable it was, coming from exclusively at the time coming from meteorites. Plutarch calls iron, in fairness, along with another element, lodestone, the bone of the gods. So again, same idea, that in some form, heaven is made up of iron. In this case, it's polytheistic, but they're thinking it's like the core element of the gods is that they're composed of this iron element. Hittite texts speak of iron from heaven, and Samaritan texts do as well, iron coming from heaven. So all of the societies of the ancient Near East and surrounding areas all had the same idea, that iron comes from heaven. So if the Quran says that iron comes from heaven, and it's saying that in a different way than other elements, nothing unique. Anything you want to add?
No, I think that's pretty clear and extensive. I think you've made a pretty airtight.
All right. So what about the Quran's case, though? What about this claim that the Quran does say that iron comes from heaven? So that article we looked at, I cannot attribute this. I like to attribute it to ignorance whenever possible, as opposed to malice. But I just can't see that. They claimed that the term alzalna is only ever used of literal sending down. It's used dozens of times. If I remember right, something like 70 times in the Quran. And the vast majority of things it describes are obviously not literal descent. It describes clothing as being sent down from heaven, food as being sent down, people of the book as being sent down, and cattle as being sent down. Yes, cattle. So cows are not a ordinary creature. They're not something that evolved, if you want to put the scientific spin on it, or something that God created on earth. Rather, they're creatures that exist in heaven, and for some reason Allah decided to send some of them down, I guess, on a spaceship. I don't know how they were sent down exactly. I know how a meteorite hits. I don't know how a life form would come.
Wouldn't it be the same process? I mean, if they're using the same words, wouldn't it be the same process? Are we having beef rain from the sky?
I guess so. I guess so.
Puts a new term to the whole raining cats and dogs. Now we're talking about raining cows. They're a lot heavier.
And clothing, I thought that the clothes we wear were manufactured by humans sewing them together, but apparently in ancient times that's not how people got their clothing. Apparently they just prayed to Allah, I need a new shirt, and a shirt came down for them. Or we can just say what's actually obvious, in that it's metaphorical in all cases, and it's not something special about iron. If you want to say it's metaphorical, and this just means that Allah provided the people the ability to make clothing and produce food and so forth, I agree.
About the cows, though, that makes a lot of sense, actually. That the cows are from space. After all, we have spaceships coming and picking up cows, right? So it's just Allah returning them. So there's proof of UFOs in the Quran.
I think you may have created a new scientific miracle in the Quran.
See the proof, the wonderful proof from Allah that cows are aliens.
So Karen says I could use a few cows landing in our pasture right now. Well, Karen, you got to convert to Islam, and then you got to ask Allah to send down some more cattle, and maybe He will. That would be quite a feat if we saw cows coming down. I think that would be a great after
witness.
Someone prayed to Allah for cows. I think you'd have millions of people converting to Islam if that was observed. So,
oh yeah, real quick, cows start raining on my head. Woohoo! I'd be running.
For real. So what about the tafsir? What did the tafsir say about this verse? Are they going to make a claim about this being a physical object coming from heaven? No, they actually give this a very interesting spin, and it's not one that I would occur to me instantly reading the verse, but knowing that this is the interpretation they give, I actually think it makes a lot of sense. I actually think that their exegesis of the text is proper here, or at least reasonable. Because, so here's what they say. Ibn Kathir says it refers to Muhammad raising an army after the people of Mecca didn't listen to him, i.e. that Muhammad was ordered to take up iron weapons and kill the disbelievers. Al-Tabri doesn't go quite that far as making it about Muhammad specifically, but he does say that the verse is about prophets physically fighting unbelievers. And Al-Qurtubi, as he is wont to do, offers the most different explanations. Basically, he collects every explanation that Muslims give, and then he gives his preference. That's the way he operates. These are the explanations that he says that some Muslims have said. That it's one of the 4 blessings from God, the others being fire, water, and salt. So those are the most 4 important things for human survival, apparently. Fire, obvious. Water, obvious. Salt, obvious to the ancient person, because it was the only way to preserve food. Iron, really important if you have a war-based society, not so important otherwise. Or that Adam physically carried iron tools from paradise, or that God created iron. So he gives it the general metaphorical meaning that I would have come into it with, that, you know, God created iron just the way he created clothing, food, cattle, people of the book, the word, whatever else it said is sent down. But I like the other one, that Adam stole some tools, right? That in the heavenly realm that there's these tools, and in the Islamic idea, you know, everyone existed in heaven first, or at least Adam did, and then they all agreed to come to earth as a test and forget about their heavenly existence. And on his way out, he grabbed some tools, because in heaven they apparently have iron tools, and not sure what their purpose is, but they have iron tools in paradise. So he grabbed some and took them with him to earth. And that's the other explanation he offers.
But I think Allah forget to grab some stars and throw it at him?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, well, maybe he allowed it. I mean, it doesn't say steal. That was my interpretation. Yeah, he just carried them. So maybe Allah gave him permission to take iron tools. Of course, iron tools didn't exist at the time of Adam.
Yeah, that's a bit of an issue. Whoops. Forget about that.
So, yeah, of these, you know, we can either go with the general metaphorical interpretation that God created iron, but I think actually Al-Tabri, and to a lesser extent Ibn Kathir, because I don't think it necessarily is exclusively about Muhammad, I think they're actually on the right track. Because if we go back to the verse really quick, we see that it says we sent down iron, but then it immediately says we're in his great military might and benefits for the people. So it does seem to be directly related, that Allah's sending of iron relates to usage of iron. And that this, for military purposes, which is pretty much the only thing that iron would have been used for at this time, makes perfect sense that it's claiming that the prophets are given iron weapons to fight the unbelievers, especially given that it also talks about people maintain justice. So how do you maintain justice? You fight the unbelievers with your iron weapons. So I actually, although it's not super obvious, I think it's actually solid exegesis. I think it's actually a solid interpretation of the verse to say that the prophets are commanded to physically fight believers, or gifted with iron in order to physically fight unbelievers. But notice what none of them said. None of them said anything about
meteorites or anything.
Yep. None of them said anything about it coming down from heaven in some kind of unique way that doesn't apply to other things. So, is it a lucky guess? Well, this one's kind of hard to evaluate. Remember, this is the least important criteria, but I like to put it in for completeness. Where could iron have come from? Could it have come from, I guess, Earth, space, and paradise, distinguishing physical outer space from heaven, or the Islamic term Jannah for paradise. Who could it have been created by? It could have been created by Allah. It could have been created by man. I don't know, maybe it was created by monkeys. doesn't seem to be a massive number of possibilities, but it's at least a little less likely than 50-50. But how about how likely is that particular guess? You don't want to just look at the number. You want to look at how likely it is someone to make that guess. Well, iron is very rare, at least was before humans learned how to smelt from the earth and discovered it in larger quantities underground and in rock formations. And it's extremely useful to ancient people, moderately useful to modern people. Obviously, steel is more refined, much more useful than iron, but still somewhat useful to modern people. So thinking that something's very rare and very useful, it's really not that unlikely that you would guess that it comes from the god or gods that you believe in. So last chance here for today. Are you ready to take your Shahada? I'm ready to say that these miracles, these scientific knowledge go beyond 7th century.
You know what? Here, I'll do it. I'll do it. Fine. There is no God but Muhammad, and Allah is his messenger.
Yeah, I think that you got that right.
Yeah, I actually did. There you go. That's much more accurate.
Yeah, that's what I hear, not in words, but in practice. That's definitely what I hear. Indeed, when we looked right at the start, they talked about the words of Muhammad when describing the Quran. So Muhammad is Allah. In practice in Islam, I actually agree that in reality, Muhammad is Allah. They're kind of one and the same. Yeah, I agree.
Well, when you got only one person saying it, and he's the only one that can hear it, and he's the only one as witness to it, and you have to take his testimony over it, and he's not going to give you any miracles because, we're not going to do that, other than his words he's saying. I have an issue.
Yes. So, side note there, since you brought that up, the so-called Hadith science, which we're always told verifies the authenticity of the sayings. If we applied that same logic to the Quran itself, we would find it highly unreliable, even ignoring all the chain of narration after Muhammad before that's attached to the different versions of the Quran. Because you got one private witness to one individual, and then you just have to take his word for it, which would not be considered valid in Hadith science, except they put a rule: Muhammad is accepted. He is beyond question. So there you go. But getting back to the iron from space, nope, no miracle. The science, technically kind of true, but it's highly deceptive because all heavy elements come from outer space, not just iron. It was plausibly observable. It was well-known information in the ancient Near East. And there's no reason to believe the Quran is making such a claim. I believe that is 0 for 5 on this particular one. And remember, you have to be 5 for 5 for it to be a scientific miracle. And as I said, I'm pretty sure, I mean, I haven't tallied it up and counted exactly, but just anecdotally, I think that this is the most common miracle offered to unbelievers.
It's the one I've heard the most. Yeah, that and the whole moon splitting, which NASA completely debunks. But yet they try to use NASA as a witness. And you read the articles, and it's like, no, they're literally saying this is not what is happening.
I'm surprised that you hear that one a lot, actually.
That's my most popular video. People keep searching it. I keep looking at the YouTube algorithm, and they keep saying, this is the most searched video you have. And it's getting hundreds of views every day. And I'm like, why? This one?
Well, I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. And it's probably a similar phenomenon as what I talked about with the miracle of the 2 seas. That it's something that Muslims talk a lot about internally. That they point out this evidence internally, but it's not something that they normally talk about to unbelievers. So you're seeing a lot of people searching for it. You're seeing a lot of Muslims searching for it because they think that this is their their grand claim, and then they find out it's not. And probably the reason they cite that often in the Islamic world is because it's the only miracle-like event, even though if you read the Quran, it's not describing something that happened in Muhammad's time, only miracle-like event that the Quran could theoretically attribute to Muhammad. The Hadith, and especially the biographies of Muhammad attribute miracles to him, in contradiction to the words of the Quran, where it says over and over again, we will not give you any miracles because previous prophets had miracles and people still didn't believe. So if people won't believe the Quran, then they won't believe you even if we give miracles. So they're so desperate to get some validating evidence for Muhammad that they'll go to this moon splitting thing, which all you have to do is read the passage. It's clearly talking about an event that precedes the end of the world and not something Muhammad did.
Yeah, but for some reason, it seemed to be a common claim that this is something that happened in the 6th century. Muhammad saw it. Some king that lived 200 years after Muhammad's death saw it in India, which I still am scratching my head saying, guys, or, Christian monks in, England saw it 400 years after the event occurred. And I'm like, there's time gaps here that you guys are just completely ignoring. But yeah, and it's supposed to be a witness to the unbelievers. If this thing was supposed to have happened back then and it was witness to the unbelievers, and no one saw it, and there's no evidence for it, it's kind of a pathetic sign, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and I like the claim that everyone was sleeping at the time. That's why no one
Everyone's
observed
sleeping.
it.
We don't have entire civilizations and religions built around looking at the sky at night. And the biggest thing in the sky just split in two, and no one saw it. Because they just all decided to go take a nap at the same time.
Let me contrast this with event in the biblical record. So when Jesus died on the cross, the Gospels record that darkness descended upon the land for a period of 3 hours. We have multiple accounts from ancient Greek Roman texts that say that there was an eclipse on that day, that the sun was blacked out. Well, hold on a second. The death of Jesus occurs at Passover. It occurs at full moon. An eclipse is impossible at a full moon. Plus, we can calculate when all the eclipses have taken place in the past history. There was no solar eclipse, but they observed one. Very interesting.
And this isn't coming from Christian sources either. These accounts are coming from Romans who were pagan, who hated Christians, writing about this event that happened that bears witness to what the Bible says happened. How much better of a testimony
and that's actually,
can you get?
Yeah, that's actually how it was preserved. That they were specifically saying the Christians are claiming this as evidence, but we just know it was an ordinary eclipse. They're just making up this evidence based on the fact it's an ordinary eclipse because they didn't know advanced scientific knowledge here. They did not know when an eclipse could occur. They did not know what caused an eclipse. They didn't know that it was the sun or the moon getting between the path of the observation of the sun and the point of the earth that you're on. They didn't know what caused an eclipse. They knew that they recorded them and they could somewhat calculate when they might occur. But they didn't know what caused it. So they didn't know that it was impossible that a eclipse could occur at Passover.
Now that we have, pulling it back to the subject, we have gone through multiple claims. Now remember that the Quran does say that if there was any fault in this, then it would not be from Allah. Mm-hmm. So if there was anything, just one thing in this false, then it wouldn't be from Allah. And as we've gone through, and as Thaddeus has pointed out, up until recently, where it seems like everyone has now changed the meanings of the Quran in order to make it match current scientific knowledge, they were teaching that it's something completely different from what they're currently claiming. This is vastly inconsistent. Now, this does bring us to my favorite one. Now, this is not claimed as a scientific miracle, because I would be shocked if someone tried to use this as a scientific miracle. But I don't know if Thaddeus knows my favorite part of the Quran, but we'll go ahead and take a look at this one. It is 1666. Thaddeus, do you happen to know which one this one is?
No, not off the top of my head. I don't have
Putting all the
verse
pressure
numbers
on you.
memorized. So,
Oh yeah, I expect you to have the entire Quran memorized. I pull up anything from it, you should be able to. Oh yeah, that's da 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 da, and go through the entire thing.
Yeah, well, I don't play Zakir Naik's game. Zakir Naik has managed to fool most Muslims into thinking that he has memorized the entire Quran and the entire Bible. He's admitted that he only knows a couple hundred verses of both of them, not just the Bible. He doesn't have the Quran memorized as well. He just knows the passages that work with his arguments and brings them up and says them really fast, and they're so impressed. Oh, Zakir Naik knows everything. He cannot be defeated.
All you have to do is know certain ones and just keep using those over and over again, and you got it. So we did have a comment here saying that we did not disprove anything other than the translation that we were using. Well, the issue with that is the people who made the translation, who were those? Did they know Arabic? Yeah. Did they put it together? Were they not the scholars? I mean, earlier in this live stream, you were saying that you were just ignorant. You were just ignorant to it. So these would be the people that you would go to for knowledge, are the people that we just disproved. So, whoopsie.
Yeah, and
because it's not my book.
I just want to be clear here. The things that I address, these are positive arguments made by Muslims. If we say that that's not what the Quran means, that's fine. It doesn't, that by itself, and to be clear, these aren't the verses I would go to disprove the Quran. I'm going to the verses you go to prove the Quran. If I disprove the translation of the Quran, then I've disproven the scientific miracle claim, because the miracle claim is based on the translation. I haven't proven that the Quran is false on that verse. That's not what I intended to prove. I intended to prove that it can't be used as positive evidence. There's a difference. I'm refuting the positive evidence today. I'm not providing negative evidence. I think we're about to do that. But I was not providing negative evidence. I was not providing reasons not to believe in Islam. I was providing reasons not to believe the positive claims of Islam. You can say that you don't need those positive claims, and that's what I would encourage a Muslim to do, is stop making these ridiculous scientific miracle claims. But you need some evidence. You can't just say, go on Hamza's den and talk to him. He has evidence. No, you need evidence yourself. You can't just assert that someone else somewhere has evidence and that they always win all their debates. Well, one, they don't. Two, debates are mostly on style, not substance. And three, if their arguments are correct, they will work for you as well as they work for them. So learn their arguments and let's discuss their arguments. Stop assuming that someone else has proof of your religion. I don't assume that someone else proves Christianity. I spent more than half of my life carefully examining my religion and verifying that it holds up to scrutiny. And you know why I did that? Because I want the truth. I do not want to gamble my eternal destiny based on what my parents told me. I'm not saying that my parents were lying. I'm not saying your parents were lying. They simply didn't know any better. That likewise, your imams, your teachers, they aren't necessarily lying in the sense that they're saying things untrue knowingly, but they are saying untrue things. And it's because of this cycle of just copying and pasting the same argument, and no one ever examines it. I took the time going back to the example of the seeds not mixing, I took the time to find the source of this image that Muslims were sharing. And it was from a 1970s textbook that did not support the claim. Indeed, the author's own description of the illustration directly contradicted it. Yet I can find that exact illustration on more than 100 different Muslim websites. What does that mean? It means no one's looking into it. Everyone's just repeating arguments that someone else said. No one's actually thinking about these things. So when you appeal to authority that knows correctly and can defend these things, chances are they just read it from someone else and they have no clue either. And that applies to the best scholars of Islam. They have a lot more knowledge. They've learned from a lot more people. But in the end, they're mostly just repeating things that someone else said.
Okay. So going back to Quran 666, real quick, one touch this as the last topic, and then we'll go into a couple other things just in closing. But it says, indeed, for you in grazing livestock is a lesson. So pay attention. This is a lesson from the Quran. It's saying that this is something you need to know. It's so important that Allah decided to put this in a book for all time, for all mankind, according to Islam. This lesson is important. It says, we gave you drink from what is in their bellies, between excretion and blood, pure milk, palatable to the drinkers. Now, Thaddeus, I personally know three things that are a bit of an issue with this. Do you see them?
So you said three things, huh?
I got three issues with this. Three. And they're all
right,
separate from one another.
Right. So I know two off the top of my head. So I'll just start with one. So the location of the producing of milk is not accurate.
What, you mean this might be an utter mistake?
Indeed. It says that it says that it's produced in the stomach. Yes? That's how you read the verse?
Absolutely. It's produced in their bellies.
Yeah, which is not correct. It would make sense why someone in an ancient world would guess that. You take food in and your body changes it into other stuff which is useful. Makes sense as a guess. However, the mammary glands that produce milk are not like, you put food or water in and they're not taking that water and morphing it into milk. That's not what they're doing at all. And they are building it from fundamental proteins and from energy, if you will. And so it's not being produced in the stomach. It's not really even being produced from the material that came from the stomach. So it doesn't seem to be an accurate description, even in a generous interpretation.
I would have to disagree with you on one aspect, saying that this makes sense from their time period. No, it doesn't. Actually, that statement is so wrong of its location. I don't know. You guys have probably never done this, but if you've ever processed an animal, it's the whole butchering process. It is very obvious where the milk comes from. And it's very obvious where the milk doesn't come from. And this is a guy who lived in the society that they would process goats, which, by the way, they produce milk, just to let you know. So they would produce milk, and you would, I guess he's never milked a goat because they're belly and udder.
Yeah.
Very different locations geographically.
I'm just trying to figure out what the author would have thought. I'm not trying to figure out how to justify it, but I'm just trying to figure out what the author would have even thought. That's the fundamental principle of exegesis.
Never milked a goat or processed a goat.
I've I would imagine that the author surely knew that it literally comes out of the udder. So they must have thought that the udder was connected to the stomach. Like, food goes into the stomach, it goes through some sort of process there, turns into milk or excrement, and then they go down two different paths. One goes into the other, and the other comes out the body. That's my best guess as to what the author was thinking.
Okay, so what was your second thing you said you saw in this?
So the second is that I forget the exact words of the Quran, but it basically says it's a palatable drink for your benefit.
Real quick, pure milk, palatable to drinkers.
There you go. Which is true for some people, but the vast majority of human beings are lactose intolerant, at least to some extent. So the vast majority of humans do not process milk properly. That's not to say that it's like, poisonous or something. Only a few people have a severe reaction to lactose and actually get sick, but it does cause problems for most human beings. So it doesn't seem to be a very good sign that Allah is citing one of the few things that we eat that often has adverse physical effects of eating it.
Now, here's the real kicker of this. Most Arabs are lactose intolerant.
I believe that if I remember right, the gene that allows people to digest lactose is found primarily in Caucasians. It's mostly Europe that was able to drink milk, and most of the rest of the world has not been able to process milk throughout human civilization.
And that goes back to whole geographic location, adaptation, a lot of science behind that. But yeah, so no, not so much palatable to the drinkers, let alone what is between, again, it says it's between excrement and blood. That really doesn't make any sense at all. My main point.
Maybe trying to think of what the author meant by the text. Although they've chosen a strange way to describe it, maybe they meant that food is broken down into three things. It's broken down to milk, it's broken down to blood, and it's broken down into excrement. And, it takes three divergent paths from the stomach. It's weird to think about because that's not remotely accurate. But maybe that's what they're trying to say. I'm not sure.
Maybe. I'd definitely look at the last thing that I really wanted. It really occurred to me whenever I read this originally. So it's saying it's the grazing livestock that has this lesson. It doesn't say female.
Oh.
And this is a huge issue.
That's true.
Because if you were milking male goats, I wouldn't drink that if I were you. Just to let you know, that's not the same thing. Though it would make a lot of sense from Muhammad.
That third one was definitely worse.
I'm sorry. That's just it doesn't say female livestock. It says livestock.
It's true.
In general.
It's true.
So, well, let's go ahead and wrap this on up. Thaddeus, do you have any sort of closing ideas?
Yeah, I have some advice to Muslims. And I would say, like I said earlier, that the things that I looked at today, they're not intended to be evidence against Islam. And if you want to say that the Quran is metaphorical, that it's not describing scientific reality or the nature of physical reality, in most cases, I would be inclined to agree. I do think that the Quran makes some claims about physical reality which are wrong. However, I don't think there's a great number of them. I don't think it's primarily intending to describe physical reality. So I have a lot more respect for a Muslim who says that the Quran is poetic, it's not intending to describe scientific reality, something along those lines. However, so first of all, I would encourage the Muslim, since this isn't a matter that would take you out of Islam, I would encourage a Muslim to try to adopt a more reasonable interpretation of the Quran and stop appealing to this as positive evidence for it. However, if you do that, you need some other evidence. And as I pointed out, this is the main one that's advanced to non-Muslims. In the Islamic world, it's perhaps not the most important. I tend to think that the most important argument made in the Islamic world is how immoral people outside of Islam are, which is subjective and a little hard to test. It's also based on pure lies, to be frank about it. But you need some sort of positive evidence for Islam, whatever that may be. And I have looked at all of the, or at least I shouldn't make a statement. I've looked at all of the arguments that have been advanced to me that I've come across. It doesn't mean I've necessarily seen every argument possible, but I've looked at every other claim that Muslims make as positive evidence for Islam, whether it's Muhammad's supposed fulfilled prophecies, whether it's the historical accuracy of the Quran vis-a-vis the Bible, whether it's the advancement of Islam from Arabia to be spread throughout the world. And frankly, I think you might actually have your best argument in the scientific claim, because all the other claims are so bad. And notice that Muslims almost always ignore the one Quran claim, or the main claim the Quran makes of itself, and that's some kind of literary masterpiece beyond what human beings could produce, because even they recognize how stupid that argument is. But that's the argument that your God advances. That's the main argument. I was probably talking with Muslims for close to 2 years before I found someone who actually advanced that as one of their arguments for the Quran. It's literary beauty, or however you want to phrase it, because it's so bad. And the other claim the Quran makes, that it's free of contradictions, isn't actually what the Quran claims. First of all, what the Quran misphrases even that exact statement, gets it backwards. It doesn't say if this had error, it wouldn't be from Allah. It says if this has error, then, or if it doesn't have error, if it doesn't have error, then it's from Allah, which means that everything that doesn't have error is from Allah, which is false. So even that statement itself is false. So I've looked at all the main claims that are brought up. I've looked at some obscure claims, and I can't find anything that I would even consider a valid piece of evidence, let alone conclusive proof for Islam. Maybe I said the scientific might be the best. Actually, as silly as it is, I'm going to change that. I'm going to actually say that the growth of Islam, that Islam is the fastest growing religion, as Muslims say, is probably the best evidence, because I think I would actually count that as a tiny piece of evidence, that the true religion should be widely accepted. So I would actually count that as a not logically valid evidence, but circumstantially valid. However, it's also true of Christianity. It's also true of Hinduism. It's also true of Buddhism. And historically, it's true of Judaism, although there aren't a huge number of Jews. Most of the world's religion derives from Judaism in the form of Christianity, and if we're being generous, in the form of Islam. So those would be your candidates. And you have to get something beyond that one piece of evidence to decide which one of those would be the valid religion. Christianity has what I can consider extremely strong argument in the historical reality of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's not the only argument for Christianity. Different Christians prefer different ones, but that's my personal favorite argument. It's the one I advance. And comparing the history of Islam to the historicity, which means whether it's historically true or false, whether the claims match historical reality, of Islam to Christianity is like night and day. That There is abundant evidence to believe in the historical reality of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And if you can prove the resurrection, you basically get everything else for free. Because if Jesus claimed to be God and proved that he is God, I'm not saying there isn't evidence outside of that one fact. There is abundant evidence of the historicity of the, say, the Old Testament, independent of the historicity of Jesus' resurrection. But you basically get everything else for free, because if Jesus is God and he did something, he claimed to be God, and he did something that only God could do to prove that he's God, then you can trust him on everything else he has to say as well. Whereas you look at the historical situation of Islam, and although it's taken for granted that the standard narrative in regards to the history is more or less historically accurate, I don't actually find that to be the case from a historical background, looking at it as a historian look at it. I'm not saying it's completely made up. I wouldn't go so far as certain people do to say that Muhammad didn't exist, but I would say that it's substantially less reliable than the historical accounts of the New Testament. And even if it was historically reliable, it wouldn't get you the same kind of benefit as the historicity of Jesus' resurrection would, because it wouldn't prove anything. There have been many people who are false prophets that Islam would 100% agree are false prophets, who raised a large following and spread substantially, and engaged in this kind of offensive military effort that Islam spread by. And it doesn't prove the truth of the religion the way that Jesus' resurrection would. So I would encourage Muslims to find some sort of evidence for Islam. Evidence against Christianity might be part of a valid discussion, but it's not evidence for Islam. Your evidence for Islam has to be evidence for Islam. It cannot be evidence against something else. I would never tell anyone to be a Christian because I've disproven Islam. I would tell them to be a Christian because of the evidence for Christianity.
Well said, Thaddeus. I guess as far as closing out this topic itself, and I would like to open it up if someone does have any questions, because we haven't been taking any questions mostly throughout this entire thing. As for my point of view on it, guys, if no matter who you are, if you're Christian or if you're Muslim, these arguments need to be your own. Stop relying on someone else's. Are you really willing to risk your eternal salvation because someone else said something? Or are you willing to dive in and say, this is by far the most valuable thing I have? I don't want to gamble it on maybe someone else might have been wrong on something. And I shouldn't be out there telling people, hey, go believe what I believe, if I'm just using other people's arguments. Because again, that ends up being a very weak stance. That ends up not only for your own personal growth, but for those of you that, for the people that you're trying to lead away, trying to pull into this, if you're not 100% on this, I would highly recommend double checking. And I'm encouraging you to read the Quran, read the Hadith yourself. I'm not saying don't read it. In fact, that's kind of most of my videos, most of my shorts are reading the Quran, reading the Hadith, going back to what it actually says. Because once you start diving into it and actually see what is going on, you end up, well, seeing what Thaddeus and I just went through, where it doesn't hold water. And if it doesn't hold water, then why would you use it for an argument if you yourself don't even believe it?
Yeah, I would just say amen to that. It's good to trust your parents and your teachers when you're a child. It's good to start with that basis when you grow up, but it's not good to stay there. I would encourage everyone, whatever religion or lack of religion they grew up in, to figure matters out for themselves. If you're in the true religion, If Islam is true for the Muslims, if Christianity is true for the Christians, then you have nothing to be afraid of. You have nothing to be afraid of by critically examining the evidence, looking at it from a reasonable level of skepticism. Obviously, we don't want to go so far as to say you can't know anything about anything. That's a possibility. You can come to that conclusion, but we don't want to go that route. But we do want to look at things reasonably, and we want to look at them intellectually. And if you're in the true religion, it should stand up to all scrutiny. You shouldn't have to appeal to some other authority. I'm not saying that you should know everything, but you shouldn't just take someone's word for it. You should investigate it for yourself. That includes me. Don't take my word for it. You don't investigate.
Double check everything we say. I have no problem with someone double checking my references. That's why whenever I do the shorts, I put it in there. I have the direct text up on the screen. Double check it. I have no problem with that. We have no problem with being held accountable.
And even worse than just blindly believing what someone tells you is what I find most Muslims, and if I'm honest, probably a large percentage of lay Christians, and that's they believe someone else has the answers. They don't even know what the answers that they're supposed to say are. They just believe someone somewhere has the answers. And I mean, you can do that. I can't tell you how to live your life, but I think it's a really dumb decision. It's a really stupid gamble to take because we live in an information-based society. You can explore these matters to your heart's content. Like I said, I spent more than 20 years studying Christian apologetics. I do not claim to know everything. I know all the arguments that come up often, right? And I know them in more depth than the average person would. But that doesn't mean I know everything. There's always more to explore. Every time I do a Bible study, I learn more about the text, have greater appreciation for the text. So absolutely, you keep exploring. Don't just stay where you are, believing what you've been told, or worse yet, believing that there are answers out there. Go and find those answers. If you're in the true religion, you have nothing to be afraid of. And if you're not in the true religion, you should want to know. If Christianity is false, and someone can demonstrate that, I 100% am leaving Christianity because I do not want to be in a false religion just because it's the religion of my parents, the religion of my friends, the religion of my teachers, the religion of my society. I want the truth, and I hope you want the truth as well.
And even if it costs, in theory, and I know this for a lot of Muslims out there, if it ends up costing you everything, is God not worth everything? Is knowing the Creator personally not worth everything? So if you're in like Thaddeus was saying, if you're in the true religion, you got nothing to lose by studying. If you're not, I'd say you have everything to gain.
Yeah, exactly. So Hamza said, I promise you'll never make me a murtad. I would not make that same promise. That is the difference here. You are, by making that claim, which may not actually be true, I acknowledge the fact that it could be blind posturing, but by making that claim, you're asserting that you don't need evidence, you don't care what the truth is, you just want to be a Muslim no matter what. And I would not make that claim about Christianity. If someone could come, I don't think it will happen because I have studied the evidence, because I've spent a large amount of time in developing into this. If Christianity was false, I probably would have found the evidence by now, but I would not make the statement that it's impossible for me to be convinced that Christianity is false because I'm committed to the truth. I am not committed to adhering to a particular set of beliefs. I'm committed to adhering to the truth. And by you saying that you can't be brought out of Islam, ignoring the possibility that it's empty posturing, you are admitting that you don't care what's true.
That's what it comes down to. And yeah, here's a little surprise for you. We are not trying to convert you. We're just trying to point out the truth. The thing is, we don't do the conversion. In Christianity, no Christian does the conversion process. That's the Holy Spirit. We're just here as the Lord's hands and feet doing our part that he has allowed us the opportunity of playing. And the Holy Spirit's with you day in, day out. He's with you when you lay down. He will be there. And if you've chosen to harden your heart to such a severe amount that you will not accept the truth, that's on you. And I'm sorry to say that. As much as it would make my life personally much easier if God just said, okay, boom, here you go. This is exactly what you have to believe, appeared before me. That would take away from the relationship we get to experience with God. And that would lessen everything about our lives and about that relationship, how to treasure it. So I'll get off the soapbox now.
I'm happy to answer any questions from the audience. Like I said, not afraid of any questions. I often open up my own streams to people coming up and talking with me live on any subject, even a subject other than what I talked about. Because again, I'm interested in the truth. I believe Christianity has the truth, and I don't believe that based on, weak evidence of people telling me it's true. I believe it based on strong evidence of my own investigations over a very long period of time. Again, I don't know everything, but I'm very confident, not blindly, based on evidence.
Well, while we're waiting for anything to pop up, question-wise, I have a couple questions for you. What do you got coming up? What's going on?
So I saw someone in the chat earlier, I don't recall who, but they congratulated me on my new video that I dropped yesterday. It's looking at the story of a man named Ahmada Mafabi, a Ugandan man who converted from Islam about 2 years ago. Spent about 6 months studying, and then immediately went out and started proclaiming the gospel in Uganda. With his church, not as an individual, but as a church. They led more than 100 people to Christ over a little over a year period. And then he was martyred in January because the Muslims, they were losing debate after debate after debate. Because he was an ex-Muslim, he knew Islam well, he knew all their arguments, he knew how to refute them. They couldn't answer him intellectually, so what they do, they killed him. So I just had that out. It's arguably my best performing video to date. Obviously, it's very early. I don't know if it'll hold up that way, but so far it's on pace to be my best performing video ever. So definitely check that out. I'll be on Bob from Speaker's Corners. For some reason, I'm drawing a name in the blink in the name. Bob from Speaker's Corners channel next week, discussing racism in Islam. We are often told that racism is a European invention, or more prominently an American invention. And we will see that the Hadith strongly imply that Muhammad was racist, and that early Muslims developed highly racist attitudes. Just based on the quotes alone, you'd think they were from an American slave owner or something. And they did so under inspiration of the words of Muhammad, which actually is quite surprising because race is a human conception. It's not something ancient people believed in. But it seems to have been invented twice independently. And it seems to have invented by Muhammad, or at least early Muslims who attributed the words to Muhammad, and again by Europeans to justify the transatlantic slave trade. Also tomorrow, this will be the last one, tomorrow on my channel, looks like it just got scheduled, but it looks like I will be on with Lloyd to talk about how Gnostic religions influenced the early development of Islam.
Well, that sounds cool. Guys, make sure you go over there, check those out. Check out Thaddeus. Get those down. I know on my part, next week, I will be joined by Avery from God Logic Apologetics. We'll be going over engaging with Muslims. So Thaddeus, do you have any?
Yeah, it looks like Hamza told me. I can answer that first, or that you just pulled up, or I want to address this comment that says you got refuted, or you get refuted by YouTubers like Dawa over Dunya, and don't seem to care to those refute those. If you were paid by the priest to do that.
Wait, this is not the first time this person has accused me of being paid. I get that from Muslims a lot. I keep getting paid, and I keep waiting for all this money. Where is all this priest money or pagan money or Pope money? Where is this money coming from? Because to my knowledge, the Pope doesn't know I exist. And on top of that, I don't care if he does. I think you need to learn Christian theology.
So to answer the question, well, first of all, I doubt I was refuted, but whatever video you're referring to, I have not seen. I don't magically know everything that's published on YouTube, and I don't generally go searching for my own name because I don't really care what people say about me. Actually, I'm surprised someone who bothered to make a video about me because I'm pretty insignificant. But if you want to tell me later what video you're referring to, I will take a look at it. But to argue that I somehow don't care because I didn't know something existed, or worse, that I'm paid off to ignore something, is just pretty ridiculous. Like I've alluded to multiple times, I invite any Muslim to come talk to me about any subject at any time. If whatever his name was, Dawa over Dunya, wants to refute me, he's welcome to schedule a time. I've had multiple discussions with Muslims. You can go watch them. You can see I'm very respectful. I give them a chance to talk. I don't cut people off. My audience often complains that I'm way too nice, that I'm giving people time to waste and so on and so forth. So anyone can come talk to me, or you can watch. If you think he refuted me, you can advance the same argument that he made in that video, and you can talk to me. I'm not afraid. Just because I don't know something exists doesn't mean that I'm paid off to ignore it. It's very funny. You used to always say that we were paid off by the Jews. I haven't heard that one. Yeah, I haven't heard that one in a while. But there still is always this implication that the only reason that someone would be a Christian priest or a Christian evangelist or whatever is if for the money, which is quite odd. To be clear, I don't make that claim about Muslims. I think that people doing it generally, there might be exceptions. There might be exceptions on the Christian side. But generally, people doing it is because they care very deeply about their religion. However, if we're only talking about money, I could make a lot more money by claiming to be a convert to Islam.
Oh, yeah. Real quick.
Just look at how your side, I'm not saying you personally, but people who are Muslims eat up testimonies from white converts to Islam. They just absolutely love this stuff. And you get these people who are terrible speakers for your side, people who I absolutely would not refer to if I was a Muslim. And they become very popular for one reason and one reason only. They claim to be a convert from Christianity, and they have light-colored skin.
You mean like Andrew Tate?
Yeah, I mean, Tate obviously was already popular. Maybe not the best example, but there's several of these people on the Dawa scene who don't really seem to have the slightest clue about what Christianity teaches, but claim to be converts from Christianity. No doubt they were born, since they're born in the West, they were nominally Christian, but they don't seem to have any actual knowledge of their religion, nor any knowledge of Islam. And they're still very popular because it somehow validates the inferiority complex, or it gets around the inferiority complex that Muslims have. Allah says you're supposed to be the best of all people. So why are you excited by people who claim to be ex-Christians? And don't claim you're not, because I can look at the difference between a Muslim apologist who was born Muslim and a Muslim apologist who was born into a Christian country, in quotes, Christian country. And I can see that even if the lifelong Muslim's making better arguments, he's generally not as popular.
So I've got a question here about contact information Yes, let me get you that. The email would be the best, and here's the email there. Send me an email. We'll talk. We'll engage. If I don't respond right away, that's probably because I'm reading it or I'm working. Either one. So
let's see. I'm looking at things where I was tagged. See if there's anything else that needs to be addressed.
I had this one right here. Grab that one.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. When did the idea that one Quran perfectly preserved start? Was it 1924? And he's of course referring to the standardized Hafs edition made in Egypt. Hafs, of course, existed before then, but it just like all manuscripts, different manuscripts have different words, and they performed something kind of like legitimate textual criticism, and picked a text that didn't exactly match any manuscript. No one knows exactly how they do it because they didn't reveal it, but they came up with this one text, which most Muslims just know as the Quran. I don't think that's when the idea started, though. Specifically, like much of Islamic doctrine, I think that this developed as a polemic against Christianity. That because of the discoveries being made in the 19th century to the 18th and 19th centuries in academia, Christians looking into the history of the Bible, trying to do what I would advocated here, determine whether Christianity is really the truth. And they started to find that there was textual variance in manuscripts. And unlike what the Muslim attitude would develop into, they said, oh, we're not quite sure what the exact word is here. None of the ideas are affected, but we want to know the exact wording because we value the scripture. We want to know exactly what God originally revealed, down to the exact word. Let's do some analysis. Let's look at as many manuscripts as possible and come to the best possible conclusion about the exact nature of the text. And they were open and honest about this. And because this was new information, this is not something that the church was prepared for because of, again, completely new information, did cause a lot of Christians to have at least uneasiness, maybe not outright doubt, but at least uneasiness. Is my religion really true? If the text varies, how can I know what it said? And because of this, I think right around that same time is probably when Muslims started to claim, oh, your text is messed up. It's corrupted. We have a perfectly preserved text. Come to Islam. And David has said that, according to Nabil, this is the single most important argument in the Muslim world, is that their text is perfectly preserved, which I had, when I was listing the arguments that I looked at, I didn't even think to mention that one because it's so silly.
It is.
There's so many. We have letter. Okay, just to digress, we have letters written from one person to another person in the first century. Not a lot, like maybe 0.001% of the letters originally written, but a few have survived. We know it's the original copy of the letter, so we know it's 100% perfectly preserved, right? And it's totally irrelevant. It has no bearing on whether what's written on that piece of paper is true or not. But it's a very important argument in the Islamic world, and I know that if you look at the Islamic scholars of the 12th century, 13th century, 14th century, whatever, they were doing the kinds of textual analysis that Christians did, and early Christians did, I might add. It was kind of rediscovered in the 18th century, but early Christians, look at the writings of the Christians who lived in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, whatever, they were discussing what the correct reading of a text was when they had two different readings. Muslims were doing the same thing, that scholars of Islam in earlier times did this openly and honestly. They tried to come to the best conclusion about what the text said, and then it disappears. Suddenly you don't find any Muslims talking about this anymore in the literature. And all I can think is that at some point, someone decided that the polemical value of telling Christians they have a corrupted text and we have a perfect text, was more important than the supposed literal words of your God. I would think you'd want to know what your God actually said, but Muslims found that the argument was effective and valuable, and so they just made up a lie. As near as I can tell, that's exactly what happened.
Okay, I think we do have one more question, and I do talk about the Crusades quite a bit. I don't see how necessarily winning the Crusades is relevant. I think there's a lot of Crusades that weren't actually mentioned. If you're talking about the first, second, third, and fourth Crusade, which kind of all happened in the same time period, almost right after each other. First of all, Christianity does not teach violent subjugation of the entire world, unlike the Quran. So no, and the Crusades were in reaction to over 400 years of continuous bloody jihad from the Muslims. All of Jerusalem, that entire area was Christian at one point until it was forcibly converted. So as far as what did they win, actually, if you look at the Reconquista of Spain, they won that. But again, that doesn't say anything about the legitimacy of a religion or not. It doesn't. It's hollow. It was the reactions of a group of nations against another nation that was constantly invading, constantly raiding the other. And it was an act of defense, plain and simple. So, real quick there, not relevant to Christianity at all. Or if Christianity is true, or if Islam is true, who cares?
Yeah. I don't think that the numbers, well, logically speaking, numbers have no relevance to truth. Speaking, less formally, it has a small implication of, at least, I would say, well, let's put it this way. I would say that if you have no preconceived ideas about what religion is correct, you should probably start by investigating the largest religion, because it seems empirically that would be the most likely to be true. But it doesn't logically equate with being truth. Consensus, even if it's 100% consensus, doesn't equate with truth. There's been times in human history where 100% or very nearly 100% of people would have believed something that we now consider to be completely false. Just sticking on religion, 100%, approximately, there might have been an outlier here and there, but approximately 100% of people in ancient Egypt would have believed in the Egyptian mythology. I would guess there's probably approximately 0 people who believe that today. So it doesn't equate with truth, but I think it's a reasonable starting point is to look at something large numbers. But no correlation between truth and numbers, let alone truth and a military victory. Although I will say this, in Islam there is a correlation, because when you assert that your God is going to give you military victory and you fail to have military victory, that is valid evidence against your religion. But if your God, i.e. Jesus, tells you not to spread Christianity by the sword, and you fail to spread Christianity by the sword, that certainly is not evidence against Christianity.
As to that effect, I would point to the companions of Jesus as such, just comparing them to apples, and how they spread Christianity to begin with, and how you had the companions of Muhammad spread Islam. And there's a little bit of a different strategy involved, just a little bit. For reference, you can see my brief histories on the rightly guided caliphs and the apostles versus the rightly guided caliphs. That I dive into the history of those and have all the references available for you guys to examine. And again, that all comes from Islamic sources. So there's that. It's not Christians making this up. It's going back to the original sources. So, okay.
Yep. And unless
it
you have
sounds-
anything else to say, I
Nope, we
think,
are good. We can go
Yep.
ahead and end in prayer, just like always.
All right.
Lord of heaven and earth, we come before you. We thank you for the opportunity to dive in and search for you. I pray for your hand to be upon everyone who watched this video. If they're followers of Christianity or not, I ask for you to guide them to come to a deeper understanding of who you are and to come to the freedom that only you can provide. I lift up a friend V in his search for you. I specifically lift up Jessica, that we had a wonderful conversation on here last year with. I ask for your hand to be upon her and guide her in every step that she goes through. And I pray for every Muslim and non-Muslim alike, that they will be blessed by what we talked about here today, and that it brings you glory and you honor. In the name of Jesus Christ, I pray. Amen.